Have Chris Anderson and Stephanie Killian and Tim Getzinger, Pofin, is it Pof? No, Pofin? Salem, thank you. Salem, Massachusetts. I don't know if that's a good reference or not, but Dan McHugh and
We try not to make this a witch hunt. So,
well done, well done. If you just have a pause, someone will come up with the right joke at the right time. And you, sir, I don't remember, you'll have to forgive me.
Roger Stanley?
Roger Stanley.
Yes, I'm in the neighborhood revitalization section.
Terrific, all right. Welcome, Mr. Stanley. So, why don't we get started? Linda?
So the first packet you have in front of you is the operating budget for DHCA, not the HIF that you did this morning, but the rest of the operating budget, although there's a little overlap. So for FY20, the county executive is recommending $58.57 million. That does include some of the HIF money. That's why that number is so large. In appropriations for DHCA, which is a 13.6% increase. On page 2, you can just see the changes between approved and recommended, and also the listing of some of the charges to other county departments where they help with code enforcement and with community development. I've also provided for you just a little summary of the changes that go department-wide that aren't determined by departments, things like compensation changes and annualizations. And so starting on page 3, by the different program areas, multifamily housing actually is, most of this is related to the HIF funding, which is why it's such a large number. There are actually only marginal changes that are noted in the budget book. And so most of this you really talked about this morning. And so there's just a recommendation to approve.
Okay.
Okay, and then affordable single-family housing programs. The executive's recommending $927,596 for this program, which enforces the MPDU program, does workforce housing, and works on single-family home programs and also weatherization. We talked a little bit about this morning as well. This is where the two positions are that are existing positions but have been previously unfunded and are now funded. And they will be helping to implement the MPDU changes from last year. And again, some of the things now that DHCA will have to monitor is the requirement for 15% MPDUs in the certain high income areas. That was part of our changes.
Yes, legislation that I introduced and
Yep.
my colleagues supported.
Clarifying, when there's a higher MPDU or other affordable housing requirement through a master plan, allowing the MPDUs to be based on floor area, so that the department will need to be working with developers if there's going to be an effort to use that flexibility to work very early on in the development. Also, there were updated rules around alternative payments for sale condominiums, and also requiring an affordable housing payment for certain developments with less than 20 units, and then better monitoring of making sure that not only is the bedroom mix in the right ratio, but also making sure that all the phases of the development include affordable housing. And so with those changes, the department has asked for the two resources. And so the recommendation is approval.
Thank you. So how many positions now do you have working on these set of issues? Ms. Killian, your mic may not be on.
Stephanie Killian, Chief of the Division of Housing. I think it's 7 that we have that administer the MPDU program, our energy efficiency programs, and our home ownership programs. These two positions would allow us to better administer the MPDU program, especially with the changes that were approved last year.
Do you envision that you will be negotiating with a large share of the projects about the floor area ratio and maybe a different configuration, like bedroom configurations, or?
We've just started working with developments that have come in under the new legislation. The ones that have come forward so far really haven't presented that opportunity, but yes, we do expect to be doing that, especially as we delve more into looking at what the existing bedroom mix is that we've been getting and looking at areas where we need to get larger bedroom units. We're doing that analysis now, and then we hope to take that information and then identify areas where we need larger bedroom units.
Okay, I guess I don't have an objection to these positions if they're needed. I guess I was just a little surprised that this area needed 2 positions. It seemed like a lot of staff to add. Not that that isn't because this area is really important, but tell me about the issues you've had with understaffing.
Sure. One of the big issues is keeping up with the pace of the development review process. We have staff that's participating in the development review committee, and they have a very short time period to look at the applications that have been submitted, analyze the mix of units, the requirements, and then really try to have some input into the process at very early stages.
Yeah.
Right now, our staff doesn't get an opportunity to attend in person many of the Development Review Committee meetings, and we'd like that to change. We'd like to have the resources to have people at the actual meetings and participating more. We'd also like to be working more with developers up front very early in the stages. Like I said, doing the type of analysis we need to do and then reaching out to folks to implement that. At this stage, we have literally the staff has a hard time just keeping up with the pace of the development of review. Our staff also does very thorough reviews of designs and the floor plans of an apartment building, for example. They'll look at every proposed MPDU, make sure it's livable in terms that all the bedrooms meet the required sizes, that the unit meets the requirements that we have, like the bedrooms have to have full walls, doors that lock, those type of requirements that we have. I mean, I'll often see my staff back there with rulers and, magnifying glasses on these floor plans. And so that takes a lot of time, and we'd like to be doing that more and doing it more thoroughly.
Okay. That's a good explanation, thank you. I would just really ask, if you're going, it sounds like you'll be participating more in the development review process.
Yes.
So I would ask that you keep the pace up. There's a lot there, but it's important that we have an efficient process. So
Oh, yeah.
as we are supporting you to participate in it, it's important that that not result in delaying the process. We want you to be staffed in order to keep up with the process with your participation.
And this will help. I mean, after the project gets development approvals, we then have to do an agreement to build with the property, and then once it's finished, completed construction, we have to do an offering agreement. Those both take a lot of time, and this will allow us to be more timely in those procedures as well.
Thank you. Councilmember Friedson.
Yeah, so I just want to make sure I'm understanding. These were 2 positions that had previously been cut due to budget constraints that we're now asking to restore them for the 145.
I believe they were
1,450
originally,
or-
yes, and they were originally in a different program that was heavily supported with federal funding, which has been cut year over year, 4 years. Those 2 positions have been lapsed vacant for 5 years, probably.
They weren't previously working on the MPDU.
Yes, and they were not MPDU program.
They're just existing pins in the department that were.
These are vacant positions that were previously funded,
Right.
that haven't been funded, and now you think you need them. Is that inaccurate?
Yes.
And now they need them in the MPDU program.
And you'd like to have them in the MPDU program?
Yes.
If you can, okay. And how are we proposing that this be paid for?
This is in the MHI.
Right,
So
these
it
were-
would be funded with the resources that are in the MHI.
The HIF. They were,
The HIF, yes, that's right.
We talked about that earlier, that
we
sometimes
did,
it
we
gets
talked
called
about
the
that this morning.
MHI.
Right. So they were noted this morning in the discussion of the personnel charges to the HIF. And there were the two areas, there was this, and then also part of the deputy director, our charge to the HIF.
Okay, so I mean, I think this speaks to the conversation that we started to have this morning of how it's very difficult to assess how much investment we're putting into the HIF and comparing it to other jurisdictions, because some things get counted towards the HIF and some things don't. It's not necessarily, some things that could be HIF or in other places, and this speaks to that. Okay, so this is, so I'm just, that's kind of what I thought, and so I just wanted to check. We approved it through the HIF, or we have to approve it here as well, or, I mean, what's?
Sort of lands in both places, but you basically, you did give the okay to the HIF expenditures this morning, and they did include this.
Okay, that's what I thought. So we're not,
You're not.
this
the
isn't
only-
an additional 145,000. This is reflecting the 145,000 that was part of what was already approved this morning.
Yep.
Okay, thank you. Oh, there you go. We just saved $10,000.
So on pages 4 and 5 is some information about the DHCA local weatherization program that is also funded with a part of the PEPCO Exelon funds. And we didn't really have time to talk too much about the HHS piece, which is the energy coach, but the PEPCO Exelon settlement funds are not appropriated in any department. They're sitting in a special account, but the departments can charge to them. And so this is the effort that's going on within DHCA.
It's the local weatherization.
And later on in the packet, you'll see that some funds that we used to get from Department of Energy have been eliminated. So this actually creates, it's actually more funding than we've had in previous years.
How many homes will we do this coming year?
We'll do 120, maybe more. That's our projection. We've done 95 to date.
And do we do the work ourselves, or do we partner with?
We have contractors and we have a
Contractors.
staff that oversees the contractors.
So we have like a home, we have a contractor who specializes in this kind of work.
We have two
Or
contractors.
we have many contractors, right.
Habitat for Humanity is one of our contractors. We did an RFP, and they were selected, and also the Community Action Council of Howard County, who administers a lot of the state weatherization programs in our area and other areas. They're our other contractor.
They have volunteers also. I think Habitat,
Yes.
they organize volunteers to participate.
I'm not sure they participate in this program as much. They have staff on, Habitat has staff that goes out, inspects the homes. They work on getting new clients and do the work.
Okay. Member Jawanda.
You asked one of my questions, I was going to say who the contractors were, but seems like another area where I just want to find with the recommendation. It'd be great to get interns, fellows, schools, people engaged in this type of work in a formal way and kind of connect the dots there, maybe with Edison or Seneca Valley, just something to think about, an idea, as we try to do more of this protection. I was right in the center of a tornado warning for the first time in Maryland, and Colesville was right in the center last week, and we were in the basement, woke the kids up, went down in the basement, and so, it's a teaching moment for all of us, but not that weatherization would have prevented the tornado, but.
But we can work with Habitat, that is one of the things they do. It'd be an interesting idea to try and have a day of doing that for energy efficiency activities.
I asked about the volunteers because there's a lot of groups that, like ARP, I know has a big program to get their volunteers to help with weatherization and efficiency. So it's an area where we could make more of a community enterprise. And that's a good point about involving students who do that on that kind of career learning. Okay, great.
The next area is housing code enforcement. There's $4.1 million in this program. We did have a pretty in-depth briefing on code enforcement recently, but I did put some information, basic information about inspections in this packet. And of course, as the annual reports come out about the results of the triennial inspections and the troubled properties, we'll return to those when you get the next reports. There are three changes related to this. The first is funding for 2 vacant housing code inspector positions. The next is an enhancement to the inspections delivery system and the routing of responses to calls. And then the third is a motor pool adjustment, which is related to the inspectors. I did just want to say that the 2 inspectors that have been vacant are not from the pool of new positions that was attached to Bill 1915. It was 2 existing vacant positions, but what you'll see on page 7 is the full complement of 40, that if these 2 positions get filled, if the funding is approved, then DHCA is authorized to fill their full complement of 40 related to housing code enforcement. And of course, there's always some turnover, so you may have 1 or 2 vacancies, but the department would actually be authorized to keep the complement full.
Okay.
Okay, so then what I wanted to say is that the executive is increasing the licensing fee as an assumption in his budget by $3. The licensing fee is through a Method 3 regulation, which he has advertised, and he's advertised it with an effective date of July 1st. A Method 3 regulation is not one that the council has to approve. So when the executive, if the executive after advertising decides to move forward with it, it would become effective on the date that he states, which is July 1st. The $3 would fund this and some other things that are included in the budget. In terms of code inspections, however, as we're discussing code enforcement and also the ability to have resources to do additional code enforcement, if we wish to get those resources from license fees, then that decision actually has to be made by July 1st because licensing is done once a year. So the recommendation I have for your consideration is to see whether the committee would support an additional $3 in licensing fees to support 3 more code enforcement inspectors. I think that in addition to just the enhancement of multifamily, we've heard issues and have discussed in the past issues around single-family home rental. This is all in terms of rental single-family home properties, that code inspection. There's also been some issues raised about inspection hours that people are available. Obviously, that can change as you have a greater pool. But the reason to put this forth now is to get the resources in place that would be the equivalent of 3 housing code inspectors. And then I would think that the committee and the department can get back together and really talk about what it is that you want to do in a program. So it's a little different if you wait, if you came back, like, for instance, in August or in July or September and you wanted to talk about this and you decided that you wanted more resources through licensing, you wouldn't get those till the following year. So that's why it's important to decide if you think you want additional resources available for these purposes now, if you want to get those through licensing.
Okay.
Because it's a Method 3 regulation, right now what we would have to do is ask the executive if he would also agree to do that, and then he would have to revise the regulation so that it would be a $6 increase as opposed to a $3 increase.
Okay, well, thank you. I want to really thank you for this recommendation and for participating in a number of community meetings recently with civic association leaders from around the county. I participated in a meeting. I know other council members participated in a meeting. Councilmember Hucker was at the meeting I was at. And, it was very uncomfortable conversations, honestly, because there's a lot of people who have a lot of concerns about, the county's enforcement of the code and the status of licensing and just a whole array of issues. And I have great respect for the work of our code enforcement team because of just how emotional that conversation can often be. But I was happy to participate in the conversation because, it's when you have that uncomfortable conversation, it's probably when you're making some progress. And so you were there, Linda, and you were taking careful notes. And you've identified a solution here that can begin to really, I think, address a significant area of need, which is the county's enforcement of rules and willingness to kind of have a more thorough process when housing in single-family home, single-unit neighborhoods is rented. And in these cases, I always just put myself in the position of, well, how would I feel if the house next door to me has been a rental before. I'm perfectly, aware of that everyone deserves a place to live, and it's never okay to say we shouldn't have renters in our neighborhood. But it's also perfectly okay to say that there are rules, and I'm not asserting that the neighbor who I live next to wasn't playing by the rules. I'm just saying what's good for the goose is good for the gander, and let's have rules and let's have enforcement. And so, and as we're looking at this ADU proposal, and this committee spent a lot of time and effort on ADUs, and one of the concerns we heard from people was about, what about crowding? What about, and whenever we say, well, there's rules we're establishing, they would say, well, the county doesn't enforce the rules.
Right. And then in single-family homes, so the council's done a lot of, terrific work to get inspections in multifamily communities, to have more inspections, to be able to be more responsive. But a lot of those inspections are just your proactive annual or triennial inspection, depending on the condition of the property. But we don't have actually the same proactive inspections in single-family home. And I think that if you either wanted to have some kind of everybody would need to talk about this, but for example, if you wanted to make sure when somebody is licensed for the first time in a single-family home that there is an inspection, just to look at the same things you would look at everywhere. Is the stove working? Is the wiring correct? Does the bathroom fan work? Do the windows operate? We don't do that right now in single-family homes, and that's not.
And if you look on your chart here on page 6, single-family homes are a very large share of the rental market.
Right. So there are those kinds of things which actually don't even aren't linked necessarily to complaints coming in. They're just good practices to make sure that we've been in rental properties and made sure that they're up to the standards that we would expect a property that somebody's living in to be up to. So those are the kinds of things that we don't do in single-family homes that we've enhanced code enforcement to be able to do more of in multifamily communities. And so that's why I think getting some additional resources to then have that discussion of what we would do would be very helpful.
Okay, I have no way of knowing which of my colleagues put their hand first, so, okay, Mr. Freeds.
Appreciate that. I appreciate the suggestion. I appreciate the broader conversation that we need more code enforcement. I think there's universal agreement from us, because we've talked about it consistently. When we were briefed talking specifically about code enforcement and got the rundown of the folks who are working in this arena, and then obviously throughout our ADU conversation, and I just think that has been a consistent theme since this new PHED committee has been in the roles that we're in, that we've been talking about the need for code enforcement, and I know that the county executive has talked about it quite a bit as well. So I think there's universal agreement on that. I think my concern is whether or not this is the right mechanism to fund the code enforcement. I don't think that it's a good idea to add another $3 on top of the $3. It sounds like less than it is, particularly when we're talking about multifamily, because it's not just per building, it's per unit, and big buildings have lots of units, and I happen to think particularly when those big buildings with lots of units are near transit, that's a good thing. And the conversation that we had earlier today was about the desperate need for housing, and how challenged we are to meet the needs of the housing market, and by adding additional costs to housing, I think is not the right mechanism to do it. I just want to make sure I'm understanding what we're talking about. So we have the two positions that we talked about at the original code enforcement conversation that weren't funded, and that now we're talking about funding that you've held vacant, but you currently have, plus the 3 that the county executive is suggesting, plus the additional 3 that council staff is saying that we could have with an additional $3. Is that correct? So a total of 6 more than the number of positions you have, but 8 more that would be potentially funded. Is that, am I missing?
It's actually, it would be 5 new active code inspectors, 2 of which are vacant and unfunded. The county executive is recommending providing funding for those 2 new positions, and I believe the recommendation from staff is for 3 additional staff on top of that to support what we've been hearing in the public regarding the need for proactive single-family inspections, as well as more robust staffing for ADU inspections.
So I think that's what I said, a total of 8.
I think it's 5.
Total of 5, including the council recommendation?
2 from the executive and 3 from the council.
So how is it $3 equals 2 and then $3 equals 3?
So,
Sometimes I miss my math, so if you could help me figure that out.
so generally speaking, the positions are around $70,000 or $75,000. So the $3 would cover 3 code enforcement positions. The executive is using the resources to do other things related to landlord, tenant, and code enforcement. It's not all going, it's not all for those 2
So the $3 that is being proposed is not exclusively for additional code enforcement personnel.
sectors. It's for related services. For example, they're going to do this new routing system, which is $100,000.
Okay, so a total of 5. That's why I was
Total of
confused. I thought
5.
it was 3 and 3 and 2, so that would be 8, but it's
5.
5, and one of the positions, or one of the additional position money is not going to a position at all. It's going to, as proposed by the county executive, to related services, support services. Is that, could you give an example of like what that would be? What aren't we doing today that we're not funding besides personnel that we would need to be funding?
So the $3 increase would cover the 2 inspector positions. It would also cover bringing back a position that would also be lapsed, which would do more outreach to the public in terms of providing an affordable housing annual event, as well as quarterly smaller events, and also to be able to kind of get the word out of what we do in terms of code enforcement and landlord-tenant and tenant advocacy through different means of media. DHCA is not a big player in social media, but I think we need to be. That's a way that a lot of folks consume their information. We don't do it.
So are we hiring a firm to do that? I mean, where's the money
It
going?
would be staffing, it would be a new staff. And then the final portion of the fee would be for $100,000 to create a new routing system for the code enforcement. And so what it would do 2 things. One, it would be able to provide an efficient means for code staff to be able to get and plan their route for the day, for the week, for the month. But additionally, it would be able to provide real-time feedback to when is my inspection coming. So think about Amazon when you get, oh, my package is 5 stops away. It'll be there by X time. Or Uber, I call up and I know that my good or service will be here soon, or it'll give me a window of time. And the purpose of that is, as we've done more code enforcement and as we've done more outreach, we've determined that folks want to be there when we're doing the housing code inspection, and they don't have time to take off an entire day for that. So if we're able to provide a window of time, a smaller window of time where they can take off and be present, I think we'll have a more healthy relationship and more consumer feedback.
So it's my understanding, and maybe Linda, you could help me with this, but it's my understanding that the county executive has proposed restricting the funds in this account similar to what has been done with the common ownership program, so that it would, the funds would stay within this program during the economic downturn. If I'm not mistaken, that was used a little bit more liberally, where the money could be used in other parts of the budget, and the proposal by the county executive, which I think makes sense. I support that. Is that right?
Yes. So during the recession, the fees that came in from common ownership communities and related to landlord-tenant licensing fees basically went unrestricted into the general fund and supported the budget, which then partly paid for the expenses, but it wasn't restricted to being held for only that purpose. And a couple years ago, when the council made changes to the common ownership community program, the council also said that its desire was that now all common ownership fees, and you'll see this later in the packet, they're held in a restricted account. So if there are revenues over expenses, which there should be, because there should be a fund balance, so if there are revenues over expenses, they stay in that restricted account. The executive is recommending that this be the case for landlord-tenant, just like it is for common ownership community.
So do we have an accounting for what we project that to mean for this particular account? Will a fund balance be likely? How much would the fund balance be? Do we have any, has there been any work on them? And obviously the county executive's given a lot of considerable, and deliberate thought to this proposal.
I do have it. I don't have it with me. However, over the years, especially with the implementation of the Tenant Rights Bill, Bill 1915, the fund balance has slimmed down. But the point is, and which Linda was making, is that you need fund balance. You do need that revenues to be able to go through, because if you do not collect as much as you are projecting in a given fiscal year, then you have over expenditures. The importance of if there will be additional code positions is that we would need additional licensing revenue to be able to support that, because it's those licensing revenues that will support that new restricted fund.
Are all the code enforcement personnel funded through the licensing revenue?
Not universally, but those that are general funded are. We also do have code enforcement personnel that are charged to solid waste, also to some of our grants. However, everybody who is charged to the general fund, who would then provide that multifamily and single-family inspections, will be charged to it. There are certain additional code enforcement responsibilities with solid waste and with federal grant monitoring that is over and above with what we normally do with single-family and multifamily inspections.
Well, if my colleagues would indulge me, I would think, at least my suggestion would be, before we talk about an additional I don't support the initial $3, although I understand it's a Method 3 regulation that we don't have a say here on, but before we then add an additional cost to a permitting fee that does have an impact on housing, that we have discussed how expensive housing is, that we at least get the information on exactly what the restricted fund revenues would be and whether or not that would cover some or all of the $3 suggestion that council staff has made. And then once we have that information, if there's a need for additional funds in order to do the enforcement that we need, I'd be open to entertaining that. But I think it's imprudent to do it before, we have a proposal to restrict the funds that should have a fund balance. We don't know what that number is, and to have a suggestion of asking, residents and property owners to pay an additional fee to support the service before we know what the actual impact is on the total fund of this change, I think is, I'd rather wait before we go to the full budget.
Sure,
Thanks.
I have done the math. Again, the margins are slim, and it amounts to about 25 cents per unit per month. But understanding that we will provide you with that additional funding. $3 divided by 12, if we're taking a look at the impact on a per unit basis, on a per month, instead of it being $3 per unit, it's actually like 25 cents per month, so that the impact on it.
We could break it down by day, it gets even smaller than that. We could break it down by hour, it gets even smaller. Than that, we can break it down by second, and it gets really inexpensive. Except that they're the same number of seconds and days, and it's just different ways to calculate. I think the more important aspect of this is figuring out, and it's not $3, it's $6 is what we're now talking about. And I think the larger point is really, before we make a decision that has a cost implication on residents, we ought to figure out what the change that is being proposed alongside it is going to result in, and then make a decision based off of that. I don't think that's too much to
I
ask.
think we could get that really quickly, and I think the committee meets again on Friday.
Okay.
We could do it by we could get you the information by then.
All right, Mr. Duando is going to speak to this issue. I mean, I'd like to have more information. I'm comfortable with this fee unless it turns out that the reserve could handle it, but Mr. Duando hasn't spoken, so let's hear what he has to say.
I like being the tiebreaker. No, I agree. If we can get the information quickly before, so this committee during this process can consider it.
Right.
Great to know what, the full picture. But I too am comfortable with the additional fee. I mean, when you're thinking about the use of this, right? So we've got the multifamily, which you are doing already, right? And that's really increased too in light of the recent legislation and in light of what you're doing with places like Enclave and the troubled properties list. There's gonna be more demand, I think rightfully so, because that turned up many code violations, and I know that's happening in other places. I know that. So we need you to have the capacity to make sure our folks and our residents who rent are living in places that are habitable and up to code. And you need the manpower to do that and the woman power to do that. Residential, obviously, during this ADU process, and as council staff mentioned, has been, I think much of the angst about ADU process was related to residential renting. And I've certainly seen that, and I think the crunch on housing has required people to accept things that they shouldn't probably accept in the residential renting market. So giving you more ability to expand and inspect there. I'm not sure that, I'd like to talk more, obviously we will if we go down this path, on whether requiring a inspection at the beginning of any residential, I don't know how feasible that is. I'd be curious to know, you can answer it now if you want, if that's practicable based on the amount of volume that we have, the 20,000 or so units. Do you want to address that briefly? Or you want to kick that can down the road?
When I get you the information on the landlord-tenant account, maybe I can give you some information on what that would require.
Okay, that'd be good to know.
Because it could, for this, since we haven't done it,
Right.
it could require like a phase-in, and then at that point, you go back to like, as you're doing with multifamily, if you go in and everything's good, you don't go back for,
Right.
some period of time, but you would have been in and checked it.
Sure,
Right,
sure.
and then you'd know,
So that's the second leg of the stool, and then the third is the ADU process, right? And it's presuming some people take advantage of this. Again, I continue to believe it's going to be mostly connected in-basement units that take advantage of this and provide affordability for people, but, you're going to have others. So responding to our residents' concern about not having enough for current code enforcement. So I think that you have all three of those things happening at the same time and really increasing. My question to you is this even enough? And maybe you come back, and I know it's hard to know on the ADU because it's not passed yet. You don't know who's going to take advantage of it. But with the other two, I'd be curious to know, like, with this increased focus from the council and others, and I would put myself in this category, particularly with the multifamily, needing to have more enforcement. When we had your code enforcers here, I could tell they're doing a great job, but I could also tell they're overwhelmed. And I think they understated in conversations I had with them offline the ability for them to, and I know we have the head of code enforcement here, I think they were trying to just be the good soldier and saying we can do it. But my understanding is that they feel overwhelmed. So my question to you is, do you think this would be sufficient, even with the additional 5 people?
It would be a start. Whether or not it would be sufficient, again, we would really have to see, and I'd have to crunch the numbers, but I can provide you with some of the different scenarios of what we can and cannot do with the additional staffing.
Right. So again, I think an answer saying that it's a floor, not a ceiling, and so I think I would strongly consider, get the information back, but I'm very comfortable with moving forward. I think we need this.
So, could I just ask, since a majority of the committee has indicated they're likely to support the additional $3, why don't I ask the executive if he would support it at the same time we get this other information back to you, and then you would have both pieces?
Thank you, let's do that. If there's a way to reduce the fee, I would rather reduce a fee, But if doing so puts the budget into jeopardy in other ways, then we'll just have to use the fee. My own view here is that inspection is really, really important because it gets to housing quality. And we want housing that's affordable, but we also want it to be housing that is good to live in. And so inspection is a major part of our affordable housing strategy, and code enforcement is a major part of our affordable housing strategy to ensure that people have good places to live. So, I've heard from landowners, property owners who say, like, I'm not afraid of code inspections. That doesn't bother me in the least. You can code inspect me all day long, because they're good owners, and they invest in their properties, and they're in it for the long haul. And I think generally that's the case. So I think we need to do more in the residential neighborhoods. I think that has been a kind of a weak spot for the county, and I'm really happy to see this proposal so we can start strengthening that. All right, let's keep going.
The next section that is in here is the grants administration for federal programs. And this is Community Development Block Grant and Home Investment and Emergency Solutions Grant. And I would say there's sort of two things. There's a summary for you of the expected uses on page 9. But then also I would, when you have an opportunity, if you go to Circle 17, and especially starting on Circle 18, going through 20, you can actually see the nonprofit providers that will also get grants through the CDBG process. So we talk a lot about the community grants process, but there are other grant opportunities, and DHCA administers the process for determining grants to nonprofit providers. And so that information is in there for you. The total amount is guided by what the federal awards will be, and then also investment income that comes back in through projects. And so in total, the federal fund action plans for this program are about $8.9 million.
All right,
Okay.
sounds good.
Okay. In landlord-tenant mediation, this is on page 10, there is $218,000 included in the budget to increase the contract with the Renters Alliance. They currently have a $70,000 contract with DHCA, and so this would be on top of that, bringing it to $288,000. The current scope of the contract is about information services and workshop on tenant rights, and then the current contract specifies services that are focused on 8 to 12 multifamily properties that are identified by DHCA to determine if tenant associations are there, and then have the Renters Alliance provide assistance on how to organize. This is in this contract, that was one of the things that DHCA wanted to make sure was that the apartment communities that were getting this attention were in a variety of places throughout the county, and so DHCA does identify those. So the additional funding would add 30 rental properties to this process, and it would add problem property task force for 3 to 6 properties that would be identified jointly by DHCA and the Renters Alliance to have them develop working groups on how best to address those problems. And then also there would be more regional tenant rights and tenant advocacy events.
Okay.
I will say I've recommended approval of this funding. I know that it's an important initiative of the executive, but I would say that I think after it's in place for a while, we really need to come back and talk about what the results are from the funding, and also to see how they're interacting with other organizations that we also fund, like CASA, to make sure that there's a coordinated effort and not duplicated efforts in terms of tenant organization.
Thank you. Can I ask the first bullet here, adding 30 rental properties, ascertain whether there is currently an existing association, if not, provide certain TA. Is that certain tenant association?
Technical assistance, sorry.
So is there a goal of how many tenant associations have to be formed, or just they provide technical assistance, but they don't necessarily have to result in get the outcome of an association being formed?
There is a goal to create the tenant associations. However, it's not every single multifamily property can support a tenant association. However, there are different varying degrees of tenant associations and tenant support that are required. And so with this funding and the services, we'll be able to be on the ground more and more often, and we'll also be able to bring in our own staff. We just recently hired a tenant advocate, and we're looking to be out in the community more to be more proactive in providing these different tenant rights and tenant services and tenant advocacy.
Okay, I guess my observation here is that I think the Renters Alliance does some good work. They also tend to blend the political and the service, and that's, you can't do that with government money. And so if we're going to be increasing our investment, we're going to need you to define some parameters and ensure that they stick to parameters, and they're providing a service to the taxpayers of the county, and they're staying within the bounds. And that may involve building some systems and changing some of the practices. I think they've started off as kind of a nonprofit, grassroots kind of enterprise, but they're trying to step up here and provide a higher level of contractual services. And so they gotta, they have to structure themselves accordingly. And I think we need to really keep a close eye. I think we have to really ensure that we're getting outcomes for this funding and that it's all staying within the bounds. So, Linda, you've recommend, that we return to this. I think we do need to return to this. Mr. Jawando.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I also obviously am familiar with the work. I think this is critically important. I know the county has, in the past and going forward, has invested in making sure that tenants know their rights and that if they want to organize, they know how and leverage their power. And I think that's all great. I had a couple questions. I do share Mr. Reamer's concern that there's proper functionality and separation. When you talk about a group like CASA, they separate, rightfully so, legally, their political work from their direct service work through a 501c3 and a 501c4 and a PAC and other things. Actually, I don't think they have like C4. So I do not think that this entity has that sort of separation. And so if you're going to be doing advocacy that I may be amenable to, but it's still, the chair's point is important. If we're going to give hundreds of thousands of dollars of county money to an organization, we want to make sure, for direct service, we want to make sure that's what's happening. And so I would ask if you can comment on it now. Under their current $70,000 contract, I'm assuming they're doing some of these similar activities, and this is just to scale it, or is that correct, or?
It's generally to scale it, especially in point number 1. However, there are additional tasks identified, such as adding the problem property task force project to 3 to 6 properties that we identify.
Okay. So, and then you have a tenant advocate. What's the other capacity internal to DHCA to help people? I thought there were other positions too, but maybe I'm thinking of something else.
So the tenant advocate is specifically for tenants, but we also have our landlord-tenant program that provides
That's
services.
Ms. Rosie
to
and
landlord,
her group.
and to tenants.
Okay, and how many people are in that group?
I think there's 7.
Okay, so this person would be in there under that?
Yes.
Okay, so this is particularly to help with the organizing of tenants. Explain the position to me again. Or for the first time?
And we've just filled the position. The person has not started yet, but they're ready to start, I think, very soon. The person is an expert in landlord-tenant affairs and is a lawyer. And the goal is, as Tim said, really work with tenants. A lot of times it's tenants who are really facing legal issues. And we're not allowed to give them legal representation, but this staff person can really work with a tenant who's facing some overwhelming issues like eviction or facing other types of fines or fees that are beyond their capacity to pay. We anticipate that in some properties, this tenant advocate might be working with some properties, helping tenants who have expressed an interest in organizing, showing them how to, and giving them information. It may even be referrals to the Renters Alliance. So there'll be some advice they can give. Our staff wouldn't necessarily be leading an organizing effort, but they'll be giving information and advice on how they can do it.
And the work that they've done for you, Renters Alliance so far, the outcomes that you've used to judge whether that's been done satisfactorily in the contract are?
They've performed their contracts satisfactorily. I don't know what else to.
And are there others, let me rephrase the question. Are there others besides CASA? Who else? This seems almost like a sole source contract too, in some sense. Are there others who? Yeah,
Not in
yeah.
some sense. In every
Yeah,
sense.
it is. Well, I was trying to be generous, but are there other? I also worry. Are there other people that? And I know that, people aren't banging down your doors maybe for this service. Other than CASA, are there other contractors and folks that you've worked with to do this? AIM, yeah, I think I'm thinking of others, that have approached you and worked with you.
And I think that this is a first step. We have done these services before, but as we are moving forward and we see studies on evictions, and you're going to see a OLO study on rental subsidies, and as we provide more code enforcement, there's going to be a greater demand for this. So I don't know that this is necessarily the beginning. I've spoken to some homeownership counseling agencies, that also provide different financial literacy that could provide those same services to renters. So I think this is the first step. There's a lot of services. As we discussed, the building neighborhoods to call home contracts in the MHI, it's not just about building the units, it's also about providing the support and the services, and so.
Yeah. No, and I think I have great concern about and think this is a great functionality. I just want to make sure we're spreading it around and getting as much bang for his buck as we can. And I guess question for council staff as we consider our grants process too. I know there's organizations, I'm not sure if the Renters Alliance has a community grant proposal before us. So do you know the answer to that? They do not. Okay, so all right, that's good to know. At least we don't want, that can sometimes, I know sometimes that does happen and it's warranted, but I just want to have the full picture. So I would just encourage you assuming these are one-year contracts and you re-up them, and that was what you would do here, that you focus on the point that Mr. Reamer and I both brought up about the legal separation of advocacy, and I think that's important, but the work is critical. And then let's see, do we need to do it more with other organizations? I think that's important, and I'm glad to hear about the tenant advocate who's a lawyer. I think that's a good step. So I'm comfortable with it, but just with the monitoring that was suggested.
Mr. Friedson.
Thank you, and I think this is an important discussion, and I think it is a specific discussion to these items and also a much broader discussion on how do we get into these different arrangements and what type of oversight do we have related to those arrangements, and how do we assess whether or not we're getting the outcomes that we would look for, and frankly, do we even have set metrics for what those outcomes are? And I think there are certain areas of county government that do this well, and there are other areas of county government that don't do it well at all, and there are other areas of county government that frankly don't do it at all. And I think I share a lot of the comments that were made, and I would throw legal aid in that process when we were doing the OLO briefing, which I thought was robust. Legal aid was at the table and talking about their work in this arena and some of the terrific advocacy and legal representation that they do. And I'm not sure in this case and in many similar and related cases that we do a particularly good job of assessing the landscape en masse and thinking through comprehensively who does what and how and what's the most efficient way to get to the destination and what the destination is and who is responsible for it. And in a case like this, with the sole source contract, is it the department that is pushing it forward? Does the department, do you work with finance? I mean, how does that process work in a situation like this? Because we have this question with Section G grants and some others where I think there are kind of broader questions of, what type of oversight we're doing. And that has nothing to do with these specific organizations or this particular work, which I think we all agree is critically important. But I think there's a kind of a broader question of, what are we getting out of it and how are we determining whether or not we're getting the best possible deal and doing the best services that we could. So I would suggest, I don't know that we need to, we've got a lot going on today, and obviously we're in the midst of budget season, but I think, you know, perhaps, Mr. Chair, if we could come back on these particular issues and discuss
How about if we,
comprehensively.
what is the process from here? Let's say we approve this funding, there still has to be a contract, right?
So my expectation is this would be on the non-competitive list that you would approve as a part of the budget resolution so that it could be a non-competitive award. And then the department would move forward with executing a contract, which, you know, can take a month, can take longer, it depends on both the county government and the vendor having met all the requirements of executing a contract.
So it doesn't come back to us.
It does not come back, the contract execution does not come back to the council.
And once we, so you get an appropriated money, the dollar amount is based off of what? The current dollar amount that you have with them, or? I know what it is in the packet, but what's the number based off of?
It's based off of a request, which is the same as the 6 or 7 requests that we have in the building neighborhoods that call home, which is in the MHI. And it's an analysis of the request and a determination that the services are desired and needed.
Tell you what, it's 3 o'clock. I think we've got a hard stop here. Why don't we just pause, not complete this, and I think we need to come back on Friday. Do we have time on Friday? All right, so we will continue this conversation on Friday. And we have a number of items that we need to get to, Mr. Anderson's portfolio. Hopefully those will be quick, the CIP items, right? But you have a presentation, I think, so that could engender conversation. If you've got a presentation, it's because you have some things to say. Exactly. So we'll try to tack this on Friday.
Okay.
Okay. Thank you so much to DHCA. Please keep up the great work.
Thank you.
See you soon.
Thank you.
And we'll move on to Park and Planning, MNC, PPC. The other Mr. Anderson's portfolio. Do you see? That is the sound of inevitability.
You guys got it quick, I knew you would.
Of course we would. How many times have you seen that movie?
Oh, man, I just watched it like over the Easter break.
Oh, you did?
Yeah.
Was it on
They
TV?
did it
or-
back to back, reloaded, first one and reloaded.
Yeah.
I once watched it like 10 times in a row with a friend of mine.
It's funny because he's such a bad actor.
Oh, yeah, it's great. It's
Like he's been like, but he's such a bad.
Bill and Ted's.
You don't like John Wick?
All right. So, Fed Committee, number 1, CIP. Casey Anderson, Mike Riley. I don't see Carl Morgan. There he is. All right.
You guys.
Pam, you've got a packet?
Right.
I heard about it. I don't know if I saw the paper or not.
Okay. I'm hoping I'm gonna bring it up. But
Yeah,
hopefully we
that's
can-
fine. Okay, Pam.
Good afternoon. Yeah, the first item before you for the Fed Committee on the MNC PPC topic is a CIP item. And on April 2nd, amendment to the FY19 capital budget and FY19 to 24 CIP and an amendment to the FY20 capital budget were introduced to the council, were introduced by the council president at the request of the county executive. A public hearing was held yesterday at which Mr. Anderson was the only speaker. Attached on circles 1 through 6 are those amendments as introduced, and then attached after that is the planning staff report. The amendments modify 2 acquisition-related capital projects. One is acquisition local parks. This capital project allows the Parks Department to acquire land that serves county residents on a neighborhood or community basis. And acquisition non-local parks. This capital project allows the Parks Department to acquire land for non-local parks, including regional, recreational, conservation, stream valley, special historic, and urban parks of county-wide significance. Okay. Both projects are primarily funded through program open space. The Parks Department has sufficient program open space revenue to acquire 2 parcels for the West Bard Urban Recreational Park, but the appropriation for those revenue is split between 2 acquisition capital projects, the local park acquisition and the non-local park acquisition. To make the purchase, the non-local park project needs an additional $2.5 million of program open space appropriation that is either transferred from the local park project or is increased by way of a supplemental appropriation. The Office of Management and Budget has recommended, and the Parks Department and Planning Board support basically the second of those, which is to amend the capital budget to accept the $2.5 million in program open space funds, and then to reduce the FY20 capital budget by the $2.5 million request. It's really just a shifting of what would be a FY20 request to an FY19 account to allow for the purchase of this property in the West Bard area for a regional park. In addition, there is a request to add, in the appropriation, the ability to accept some developer contribution. And those are listed at the bottom of page 2 of the staff report. So council staff supports the planning board's request to amend the budgets and to set up the ability to do this transfer.
Okay, where is this land exactly?
It's just south of the shopping center along the Willett Branch, south of the HOC building,
On the same side as the stream as HOC?
same side of the stream as the HOC building. But
So it's-
I would say a couple hundred yards south of there.
Okay, so it's closer to, is this the land that is really that park area where you're on the trail and then you kind of have this adjacent plaza park that is
Yeah, it's sort of
integrated into the
all
trail?
out. We're going to have basically a linear park, very narrow strip next to the stream as it's naturalized, and then there's an area where it'll widen out where we're trying to acquire these two.
So it's very much connected to the trail. This is a major destination or waypoint on the trail, and it is part of the ultimate Watts
Yes, it's
Willits branch. I don't know where I got that from. It's part of the ultimate Willits branch, but it doesn't cover any of that. It's
no, but it's sort of an area along that planned stream trail and stream park where you'll actually have some more room for some recreational amenities. It won't just be a pathway next to the beautified and naturalized stream. You'll actually be able to program a more complete recreational.
And will you be able to get contiguous properties ultimately through the branch?
Yes, and we're working on that. I would say we're actually ahead of where I thought we'd be at this point.
Okay.
We've got a couple done, and this is 2 more parcels, and there are a couple segments in between, but I think we're very much on track to connect it.
And this is the money just to purchase the property. It doesn't cover any park development or anything.
Right, and in fact, we won't actually we're going to allow the current tenants to stay for a few years because we're not ready to develop the park, and that allowed us to save some money on the acquisition cost. But by locking it up now, we know that it will be there when we are ready to develop it as a park.
Super. Mr. Freitzen.
And it also includes remediation from the property owner, which would have been borne by
That's right.
taxpayers.
There's potentially some environmental issues, but the property owner agreed to make an allowance for that as part of the transaction, so we can get the property in a condition where it's ready to develop as a park.
Yeah, I mentioned this the other day at full council, but I think this is just a really creative opportunity that the park staff deserves a lot of credit for coming up with, of leveraging program open space dollars for a significant investment that would have cost even more if not for this. And we would have been sitting on a property that we wouldn't have been ready to move forward with anyway at this point. And I think with the Willett Branch Greenway, that really was just an environmental easement, but for the fact that now we're going to have a terminus that actually will activate that. And so it would have just, in my view at least, knowing that area, would have just served an environmental purpose. Now with a significant placemaking park at the end of it actually will provide community benefit in additional to environmental importance there as well. So I think that this has an even broader importance to the community there, because that greenway just wasn't big enough in and of itself, to really get people to go there. But if you already have a destination type park that is serving the broader community, then having a trail that you can walk down that's accessible to an attractive place really becomes great. So I just wanted to highlight that. Thank you for it. I think it's a terrific project, and I'm very supportive.
It's a big community benefit, and I don't know that anybody who needs to hear this message is in the room right now, but the only reason we're doing this is because we did the West Bard Sector Plan, because we took on the opportunity to have some development. Oh my God, development in West Bard. It's terrible, it's horrible. Actually, it yields really tangible community benefits, and this park, it was a core part of the vision of the West Bard Sector Plan, as is building a very, very attractive, very desirable, very high quality, you can't even call it a town center, it's just a retail center. It's gonna be great when it's all done, despite all of the intense criticism and the, hyperbolic overreaction. That's a redundant phrase, but you get what I mean. This would not be happening without the West Bard Sector Plan. And I actually, maybe someone who needs to hear this is an environmental activist who came and went to bat for this plan, because the advocates for the branch were part of the process, and they understood that there was an upside to be gained here, and they came in and they met with us and they said, we understand, we get it, we support this plan, provided that it has all of these measures to address the opportunity to build parks and to restore the branch. And here we are, we're keeping up our end of the bargain. We need the community to continue to support the full vision of the plan. Mr. Juanda.
And I would just say, more parks the better. I know we've got the lead for parks here, and particularly, and I was very impressed with the work we're doing to try to envision how to bring more urban parks in places where they traditionally haven't been. And so I couldn't agree more that this is a good use and reallocation, and I think you're going to get a 3-0 here.
Okay, so the plan for significant park development that is only possible because of the West Bard Sector Plan is now before us and approved without objection. Okay, keep going.
Great. We'll now move on to the item 2, which is the FY20 operating budget for the Maryland National Capital Park and Planning Commission. Give a second or two for people to take their seats. I'll give you just the budget summary that I provided at the very beginning of a very lengthy packet. The budget summary is that the executive recommends $129.3 million for MNC PPC, which is a 0.8% increase over the appropriated FY19 operating budget, and 4% less than the FY20 MNC PPC budget request. The council staff recommendation is to approve $131.6 million, an increase of $2.3 million over the executive's recommended FY20 operating budget, and it's $3.6 million less than the FY20 MNC PPC budget request. It's an increase to the park fund of almost $1.7 million and an increase to the administration fund of $650,000+. The budget for the Maryland National Capital Park and Planning Commission includes tax-supported funds, self-supporting funds, debt service, and reserves. The tax-supported funds are the administration fund and the park fund, and they represent a lion's share of the operating budget and this packet. The Commission's total FY20 budget request is $169.3 million, which includes enterprise operations, property management, debt service, and special revenue funds, and it's all covered in the staff report. The appropriation required to support the operating budget is $169.3 million. If you'll turn to page 3 of the report, you get a breakdown of what that is. It shows the administration fund, the components of the administration fund, which are the Commissioner's Office, Planning Department, Central Administrative Services, and some non-departmental costs. There's the park fund, then followed with grants, the self-supporting funds I mentioned, advanced land acquisition fund, there are internal service funds and special revenue funds. So this represents an appropriation, but the operating budget is the tax-supported budget, and that's what we tend to focus on today in this packet. I'm going to keep moving unless you guys indicate that you want me to stop and you have questions. Is that?
Yep, keep
Okay.
moving unless
Okay.
we pause you.
So, turning to page 4, we have the spending affordability guidelines. Every year, with the upcoming budget, the council approves an FY20 affordability guideline. For MNC PPC, it was $125.2 million. The commission request for this spending affordability guideline purpose is $131.8 million, and the executives recommended amount for this sort of same way of measuring the budget is $126.5 million. And then there's a summary in the middle of page 4 that shows sort of what this was in comparison to FY19, the request, and the county executive recommended.
I also had that same reaction. Let's do it all. Sorry.
Compensation, as you know, was a conversation that was started yesterday and will be continued next week. So we don't spend a lot of time on it in this report since we have some unknowns remaining there. The FY20 budget as submitted includes an increase for MNC PPC for its compensation marker of $2.1 million. There are major personnel costs. They include a decrease for OPEB, pay-as-you-go and pre-funding, a decrease in pension costs, an increase in health insurance costs, and a decrease in the reclassification marker for total compensation change in FY20 of about $1.3 million.
Have you negotiated contracts for 20 yet, or where are you on that?
I think we're pretty close, but we don't have a agreement yet.
So if you turn to page 5 of the report, there's a section on information technology. I can cover it, or we can keep moving. There's not really a recommendation to it, but it is information. It looks at, it's a summary of what are the information technology groups within the commission. Last year's report had a conversation about cloud migration. They're continuing to move forward in that. There was some concern that at the corporate IT level, they were still investing in on-site servers, but they have definitely moved away from that. There's big progress in going to virtual servers, and they continue to share resources across agencies. At the bottom of the page, you'll note that we're on to the major changes in the FY20 budget. Most of these major changes were covered in the chair's letter, which is at circles
just
1 through 10.
Want to thank you, Costas, and I see Dieter is here as well, so it sounds like you've done a lot of work with park and planning on the migration, so appreciate that. Thank you.
Okay.
Keep going.
So changes in compensation, as I mentioned, haven't been a big focus because it's not finalized yet. Non-compensation cost changes include an increase to debt service, an increase to the Park National Pollution Discharge Elimination System, assorted operating budget impacts of capital projects, new initiatives under the subtitle of Investment in Critical Needs, and operating budget major known commitments. Total non-compensation changes as compared to the FY19 budget are $6.2 million, or 4.6%. If you turn the page and you're on to page 6 now, you will see that we are going to start to cover the park fund. The Montgomery County Park System includes 241 parks and almost 37,000 acres of land. The FY20 tax-supported funding is $101.8 million, excluding grants, debt service, and reserves. This represents a $5.2 million, or 5.4% increase over the FY19 approved budget. And you have the breakdown.
It's actually 422 parks, and Casey's going to
sorry.
start his year journey over again because he didn't get that one that's coming online.
Wait, what?
We need to make it.
You found a park?
There's an extra, well,
It's gonna be.
We bought one.
Ah, you've added one. They've added one. Nice. All right.
We're going to try to buy parks faster than Casey can visit them.
Exactly.
But this is going to be a very expensive effort.
And if you find one, that's even better.
As you'll move down the page, you'll see that the report summarizes that are changes from FY19 to FY20 in the compensation adjustments, operating budget impacts of new parks, the National Pollution Discharge Elimination System, known operating commitments and program enhancements. Those are all there. There's information there for you. If you have questions on it, we can pause and do that. Otherwise, we can continue to move forward, and in very short order, we're going to get at the reductions to meet the executive recommended funding level. So,
Okay. Let's talk about the recommendation from the executive.
okay, that's on page 8. To meet the executive recommended funding level, the Department of Parks would have to reduce their proposed budget by a little more than $4.3 million. But before reviewing that, wanted to note that the commission takes the recommended reduction that they need to meet the executive's budget, and they prorate it across CAS, planning, and parks. So you'll see 2/3 of the way down on page 8, what those amounts are that are target amounts for reduction for each of those individual units.
What is the percentage decrease or increase that was recommended for parks?
The decrease in the parks budget was, it's here somewhere. I think for the parks, it was around a 4% decrease in the parks budget. Mike, do you think?
County Executive recommended a 4% cut to the parks.
Could I
Is that right?
clarify that?
Oh, yes, everyone B.
Sorry.
Jennifer Nardine with Office of Management and Budget. It isn't broken out in a calculation here, but on page 6, if you subtract what the executive is recommending from what was approved last year, you'll see that it's about an $800,000 increase. So he is recommending an increase over prior approved levels. It just isn't recommended at the level that's being requested by Park and Planning.
So it's 4% perhaps short of the request.
Well, we can
Of the
get to that
request.
in a minute, but I think if you
Right.
look at some of, yeah, I'm not sure I totally agree with the calc. I think it's not inaccurate, but I think it doesn't fully reflect the move to a new headquarters, some of the other, 1-year costs, and so it's not an apples to apples compare. I mean, it's easier if you're talking about program by program, if you look at what the, cost is, and if we look at the full budget program by program, you wouldn't see equal or higher funding in all the programs. Is that a fair?
Yeah, or another way of saying it is that 0.6% nominal increase is nowhere near enough just to cover
Personnel.
funding the collective bargaining agreements, compensation, and operating budget impact of Wheaton headquarters and the other additional new park facilities that have been built over the past year and now need to be maintained and operated. So the county executive's recommendation did not allow us to even maintain the current park program.
Go ahead. That part for me was particularly troubling, like the current status of things, the contracts. We're having this big discussion about contracts on the other side, and we'll have a more robust on Tuesday. Was that not factored in go ahead.
Sure. So when you're considering the requested level of funding, understand that that doesn't include the 4% recommended reduction that the executive had to request as everyone was building their budgets for the FY20 budget, just due to the fiscal constraints that he had to address in order to transmit a balanced budget for you to review. And so a lot of the department budgets that you are reviewing take into account a 4% reduction before compensation and other known needs are sort of addressed. And so due to the timing and when this budget is prepared, it doesn't include a 4% reduction on the tax-supported resources before asking for additional money. And so all of that leads to a larger discussion of what is needed.
It's kind of a philosophical debate. So, but because
We're going to stay in this
I think we
topic.
should stay in.
We're going to stay in this topic, but I want to just organize the responses here. Great questions and great questions. But I feel compelled to respond first. So the county executive asked all departments for reductions, proposed reductions, and then accepted them varyingly. And we just had DHCA, which got a 15% increase. Parks, on the other hand, and then for the executive branch, not only are the contracts funded, but there are departments that have increases and, contracts are funded. But for parks, the budget is decreased or it's not increased, and the contracts aren't funded. They're just like there's no funding provided to support the contracts. Am I wrong? Is that the way you see it?
That's right, and county government overall, while it varies department by department, is up about 4%. I believe it's accurate to say that we got the smallest, the 0.6% recommended increase is the second smallest of all the departments or other agencies. The only entity that got less was, I believe, Montgomery College.
Yeah, I think, too, there are a couple of other factors that come into play.
Mary Beck, introduce yourself.
Oh, I'm sorry, Mary Beck, OMB. I think that in the past several years, frankly, the county government has had much smaller increases than other agencies. When you look at the percent increases, we can get you that information, but that has been the case. I think a lot of the reasons that you saw increases in county government to the extent you did was there was really a recognition that some of the underfunding that had happened, that quite frankly, even if we didn't budget for it, it was going to happen. And I'm thinking about fire, for instance, and corrections. Some of those things were finally started to be acknowledged in the budget. So that did lead to a larger increase. Jenny also had some information on debt service.
We just wanted to clarify that the increase that the executive has recommended is for the non-debt service expenditures, and so he has fully funded the increase in debt service as well as provided the $800,000 specifically in this park budget on top of what had been approved last year.
Councilman Freeds.
Yeah, I think this is a much broader philosophical question than just the Parks Department, but I think the Parks Department is a perfect illustration. I mean, I just have a disagreement with the way that that is characterized. I mean, I know that the idea that the positions in fire are the difference here, and that is going to right-size the budget. I think, first of all, I've said it many times, I'll say it again, we're waiting to see the restructuring plan that the county executive has. This budget isn't really it, and is, in many ways, it's the opposite of it. This is the more is less plan, and we're waiting for the less is more plan. But, I take at face value the idea that there's a recognition that there are certain aspects of the budget that needed to be right-sized, and I don't have strong disagreements with, that approach, and have talked to the county executive directly on, even before he took office, on the fire issue of overtime, which is a huge issue that the county has been grappling with for a long time. But to suggest that that's the reason why county government is growing by 4% and the Parks Department is growing by, a fraction of a percent that doesn't even keep pace with expenses at a time when they're moving, which is a large, one-time expense, I just think is disingenuous. It's just not accurate to what the reality is. It's fine to say that there were other priorities in the budget that needed to be funded ahead of it, and that the budget reflected the county executive's priorities. I think that that's fair. We can have a disagreement of what those priorities are and should be, but I think it's not accurate to say that that Parks budget is increasing when it's really not, in terms of the programs and the needs of just fulfilling what has happened. And I think in many ways with personnel, you can't not reflect the personnel changes and not consider that to be an unfunded mandate, and you can't fund something at a lower level with a far lower increase than the rest of the budget and say that you value it equally. It isn't as much, it wasn't and hasn't been as much of a priority in this particular budget. There could be perfectly reasonable and fair explanations for that. We can have philosophical disagreements of whether on an individual basis we agree or disagree with them, but I just have a disagreement with the way that it's been characterized, and I think that's reflected in the community meetings that we've had with folks who were upset. And I think the parks is one of the main areas that folks are upset about, where, when we've had, all of the efforts to bring the counselor to the community, and the town halls and the Fridays with Frieds and Coffees that we do, and all these other efforts, they look at the budget, and notwithstanding the way that it has been framed, they see what the numbers are, and they know what the reality is, and how that will impact their life and their family. And so I'm looking forward to restoring this funding, and I will be pushing to put it onto the rec list. And as the parks lead and just somebody who believes very strongly in the need for open space and for parks is an important and critical aspect of quality of life, and increasingly asking parks to do more and more, like take on ball fields, et cetera, that you have to fund what you ask for. And we can't ask for things and then not fund them. And I think in some ways, this budget has continued to ask for the same things we've been asking for, but hasn't put the funding in to fulfill it. And I'm hopeful that at the council level, we can right that and make sure that we're moving forward and all on the same page.
Okay. let's continue.
Okay, so what you'll see toward the bottom of page 8 is that to meet the executive's recommended budget, the park fund, given the prorated amount, must reduce their budget by about $4.1 million. And if you turn the page then to page 9, what you'll see is that the Parks Department went back, they looked very closely at what they had asked to be budgeted for. Had any of the costs related to any of those things changed? And had any of the costs related to FY19 changed? Were there any savings they could take advantage of? You know, the budget that they prepare is done late in the fall and transmitted here by January 15th. So, you know, we're 4 full months later after that. There's sometimes changes that can occur. And so they've gone back, they've looked, and they have offered $2.3 million in things that will be reductions for them and are not requested to be on the reconciliation list. What that leaves is about a $1.8 million difference. That money is shown up in 2 tiers, Tier 1 and Tier 2, as essential needs that they would like the committee to consider for reconciliation. The staff supports retaining all of the Tier 1 and Tier 2 priorities for restoration, as Councilmember Friedson has.
Can I just briefly before you, so again, on the top of page 9, there are a number of changes that you made to absorb a lower budget. And these, so now we're going to go on to things that you just need more funding for, you couldn't figure out how to absorb.
That's
Okay.
Correct. And so the things that are for discussion for the committee to consider whether they want to put on a reconciliation list are the items in Tier 1, that's at the bottom of page 9, and at the top half of page 10 are the items in Tier 2. We can go through each item by item. It's up to the committee's will.
Mr. Friedson, what would you recommend we do here?
I think you just quickly list them. I mean, I'm going to be supporting putting all of Tier 1 and all of Tier 2 on the rec list. I'm opening to do that in 2 separate tranches to separate them out. I see Tier 1 as, you know, basically core, existential, cannot, you know, I don't think the Parks Department can move forward with what we expect them to do currently. And Tier 2, I think, are critical to continue building upon the work that they've been doing and the expectations that we have said. And so, you know, I'm hopeful that our full council colleagues will support all of Tier 1 and all of Tier 2, but, you know, I think we can separate them into two tranches. But, you know, maybe just for the record, just so folks who are watching don't have a pack in front of them, just, I don't think we need to explain everything, but maybe just list them so everybody knows what we're talking about with the 2 tiers.
definitely want to, yeah.
Yeah, but I don't think we need to go into full programmatic
Sure.
detail of each item.
And I'll just mention that if someone wants to look at the copy of the staff report online, or if they have it with them, details for these items is found on page circle 19. So it does exist, and we don't have to get into all of that. For Tier 1, there's 1A, which is the operating budget impacts of the Wheaton headquarters. It's 300.
So on this item, you're now having more conversation with DOT, I understand, and see if we can patch some of, find some alternative sources.
With OMB.
OMB, okay.
Yes, Mary and I had a great conversation late last night about how we put our OBI together for the headquarters. I don't think we're in disagreement. I think, I won't speak for Mary, but there was a desire to assure that we didn't have any duplication of costs anywhere between the county government's operating budget, between the capital project for Wheaton redevelopment and ours. I don't believe there is, but we're certainly more than welcome if we find there's duplication to reduce the numbers. And then the second issue is that we were not taking any actions with our service contracts for the new building that would bind the county to certain expenses in FY21 and beyond as our tenants in the building. They will share in the costs of certain things, and I think that's something that's very easily worked out through the way we enter into our initial contracts so that we're not doing that.
And I would agree with that. I think that most of these costs will really hit in '21, and we've got time to work out the details. And as Mike said, we don't want to have the duplication. Our major concerns or questions had to do with these costs that are being shared. and just making sure that we're fully on board and not having any kind of duplication, and that we've recognized savings from old operations coming into the new building. But as Mike said, we've got time, and there's already been a lot of legwork done. It's just getting through those final details.
A lot of the significant costs are related to IT, network, data center, audio, visual, and I just want to say that there has been intense coordination for more than a year between county's IT, DTS, and our IT folks. There are agreements drawn up, because this is very complicated, as you can imagine. This is not a project we do every day of the week, and this is, the purpose of this at the end of the day is Wheaton redevelopment, and we want to go into this building making sure that we're fully prepared to care for it as the asset that it will be in Wheaton.
So is this item, this 1A, going to remain, or are we working on this and we'll chop it down?
Well,
I think the agreement is it remains, but if in discussions with OMB over the next few weeks, we find there's any duplication or any reason to lower any cost,
Then
that we
you'll let
would
us
come
know
back
right
to
away
you
and
before the final action.
before the reconciliation.
right.
And you agree on the timing of the move
Yes.
and
there's
the
no-
cost that will be incurred this fiscal year?
And that park and planning has to, in advance of people moving in, incur certain costs
Right.
like Wi-Fi,
Right.
because you can't install any technology in a building anymore that doesn't depend on Wi-Fi.
Right. So these are some of the things that I think, I would have thought would have been funded in the original budget. We're asking, we've made a deal to move, and there are costs that are incurred as part of moving, and this was some of the comments that I was making earlier, and what the expectation would have been, that this would be baked into the budget, and the expectation of what is in the budget. I'm happy that we're now getting together and working it out and figuring out what that looks like, but that, I think, is some of the comments that have been made today. Certainly my comments, I think, are related to that.
Well, there have been a lot of meetings for a long time, frankly, right? There've been regular meetings with DOT to discuss a lot of these issues. I think where Al was talking about yesterday is there's some specialty move. For instance, I believe Park and Planning wants to hire someone to do some of their moving of IT stuff. We're using our DTS folks. So it's just a different approach on some of those things, but all the furniture will be moved and those kinds of factors. So I think on the scale of the project, this is noise. There are a lot of things. I think the exciting thing about this project is we're actually going to have agencies and departments with, integrated missions co-located. That's going to be the real success of this building. We're already talking about the replacement of the ActiveNet system. We actually will have all the departments and agencies using it in one building. So,
Again, I think
these
to a
are the-
certain degree, on the scale of the total project, I suppose you can consider it noise. I consider it an obligation that was punted to the council from the executive, and asking us to not decide whether a particular program was a priority or not, which is what the normal budget process is for, and us adding to the rec list what our, council priorities are, which understandably could be quite different from the executive's priorities. Any executive, any council, that is the case. What we're talking about, an already agreed upon move and the baked-in costs associated with that move, that's not a priority. This isn't a priority question. This is an operational, existential, core budget function.
This is utilities. There are some Wi-Fi things, as they understood that they couldn't share the Wi-Fi network. There were some additional costs, so
As far as solutions go.
I think we're in a good place.
Okay, it sounds like everyone's working together well. Do we, but to the extent that we have to add funding, is the appropriate way to add funding to parks and planning, because planning has its own, or is it to the CIP item for the project?
Based on the nature of the expenses, a number of these are clearly operating expenses, and a number of these would be cash-funded projects. I'd have to look line item by line item to see. The only way this helps you, quite honestly, from a cash perspective, is if it's somehow a bond eligible.
Bondable.
But it will take away from other bond things you might want to do, so.
There's no free lunch.
Right, but we could look at it if you want to have us sort of dissect if there's something among this 300 some odd thousand that could be bond funded.
Yeah, I mean, that's the issue. It is a lot of money in the rec list. Look, let's just keep working on this. We would like you to please to look at it, see what's bond eligible. You know, getting $100,000 into the CIP because it's more appropriate there actually does make a bit of a difference. So to the extent that anything that should be in the CIP can be in the CIP.
Do that?
Because it's easier to put 100,000 in the CIP than it is in the operating budget. Mr.
But the likelihood of bond-eligible projects and what we're talking about here, which are largely moving, especially even technological, is extremely limited. So the efficacy of that is,
It would be the Wi-Fi installation maybe that I could look, I mean, we'll look to see, but it's mostly operating.
Yeah, I mean, the concept of preparing operating budget impact is not new, and we do distinguish pretty carefully between what's capital and what's debt eligible and what's operating as we come up with these costs. We'll certainly work with OMB to look at it, but it's not like we didn't already filter this through the fact that these should be operating costs.
Okay. All right, keep working on it.
so are we, so I had suggested putting on the full, or we still need to go through the items, right?
Yeah, we're going through the items, and you're talking about the other item, right? The other-
No, I would like
You
to
want to
say
talk about
something
something in here?
related to
Okay.
this, yeah.
All right, so we're going through the items. The proposal is to add all the two tranches, but we're going to go through the items one by one. We're continuing to work on the operating budget impact of the move, and that can be adjusted as we go. So if we get more information that helps resolve issues, then we'll factor that in as we go. But for now, we'll just go with this, and then we'll keep working on it, so, okay. Did you want to speak to this
Yes.
specific one, or just another item
Just
in tranche A?
The kind of holistic, just the whole thing. So if you want to list them first, and then however you want to do it.
Again, we're going through 1A, B, C, and D
Right.
now. We just started with 1A. So
Okay.
does that explain, or do you?
I can wait till the end. I just want to talk about the tier 1 and 2 holistically. I have a comment
Okay.
about that. So I can
Okay.
do it now, or I can wait till after they're listed. It doesn't matter.
Okay, why don't we just proceed with these items, and then, you know,
Okay.
maybe that'll inform
Okay.
what you want to say.
If we move on then, the next item, 1B, is the operating budget impacts for new and expanded parks and ball field irrigation. 1C is improving the quality and playability of ball fields, and it's a position for a senior equipment operator, supplies, and seasonal staff. It's all three of those things. And then 1D is improving the quality and playability of ball fields by hiring an inspector position and supplies that also go with that.
Okay, so basically, we have a lot of funding now here that we need to add for ball fields. This is a major issue, and this is generally to support many fields. This isn't for any specific field renovation. This is kind of like cross-field resources.
This is to support the 700-plus fields that exist, public fields at schools and parks. And 1C is the on-the-ground, boots-on-the-ground staff who are actually out there doing the physical improvements with the machinery that needs to be done to create better fields, along with the supplies and seasonal staff. And 1D is an inspector, and you might wonder why an inspector. On the way here, Chair Anderson and I drove by Wheaton Edison High School and got out and took photos of the staging area that is our Glenmont Park, local park, where there will be a baseball field built at the end of the day. And one of the things we need to turn around in the county is we need to build fields right from day one. And I won't go into any more detail than that. And you can imagine the challenge of taking a 20-foot tall pile of dirt and construction debris and a sediment pond that's been accumulating sediment, and then turn that all into a field that will be sustainable. And in order to do that, you have to have qualified inspectors out there making sure that the contractor does it all according to the specification. And that has not historically happened in these staging areas, particularly at the school sites. That is why.
Happened at my kid's school.
You go back.
Park Elementary. It was
And
just
it-
grass over a construction debris.
After 6 months, there's no grass. There's not only no grass, there's undulating ground, and there's rocks, rebar, bricks, you name it. So we need to get away from that.
So this is a system improvement. You know, this initiative of building and maintaining great grass fields has been a really exciting priority. You've made a lot of progress, and we've got a long ways to go. You know, we catch a lot of flack for the very small targeted use of synthetic fields, you know, but I think we all know that there are some fields that have to be synthetic because of the intensity of use, but almost all fields should be grass. It's just a very few cases that with synthetic is necessary. But a lot of communities don't take that approach. They just think synthetic is better, and they, you know, it's kind of lazy thinking, and it's not, but we're actually investing in the infrastructure to support grass and have it be a great playing surface as much as possible. So we're putting our money where our mouth is, while recognizing that it's not the only solution. There are very, very few but targeted cases where you need a different kind of surface. But here we have the need for a lot of investment in the equipment to support grass. I remember the county executive supporting legislation at the state level that would not allow any funding for synthetic fields, you know, and yet here he is cutting or not funding the equipment we need to support grass. You know, you got to get behind the grass program one way or the other. And so that's what this is about. We need to fund this maintenance program. We got to put our money where our mouth is and get this thing, you know, to a better level. So I love what you're doing. It's been a big area of priorities, but there's more we can do. And we need to keep building on it going forward. That's my soapbox on grass. This might be a good time. Well, yeah, actually, it's a fine time to bring up your well, okay, actually, it's not. Let's get through tier 3, and tier 2, and then we'll talk about additional initiatives. Councilmember Jawando has a proposal that he has offered with other council members to specifically renovate some fields, so he wants to talk about that. So that is tier 1 of the parks. Any other comments on tier 1 of the parks? All right, tier 2.
Okay, if you'll turn to page 10, at the top half of it, you'll see Tier 2, Department Priorities for Restoration. 2A is an infrastructure backlog. It's regular maintenance and basic infrastructure for the 90-plus-old park year system. 2B is a GIS asset specialist. This is to help optimize maintenance efforts and improve the level of service to park patrons. If you can get this position filled, then they will be able to take a better and more efficient view of what needs done where and how to get it done quickly. I'm sure Mike can speak to that if you have questions. 2C is really reflects the need to cover inflationary increases. 2D is for contractual increases to meet department obligations. 2E is a Chief Information Officer and commission-wide IT initiatives, update the Active Directory project, and that pretty much covers it for Tier 2.
Comments on tier 2? All right, Mr. Dorn.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So question, we met, and I concur with my colleague, Mr. Friesen's recommendation to put both on the reconciliation list, with the caveat, I just want a feedback from you, realizing nothing's guaranteed when it goes into the pot. And are there, I think I know the answer to this, but I'd like for you to speak to it. Are these priority ranked? You know, I know when we had spoken, it seemed like the infrastructure backlog in the GIS asset specialist, as far as the ability to map and see where things are and use parks more effectively, were among the more important on this list. Other things you could, not that they're not important, but that you might be able to do in other ways. Could you want to speak to that a little bit, just so we have that on the record going into the...
Yeah, the short answer is yes, they are rank ordered. And as to both that infrastructure backlog and the GIS asset specialist, you're correct that those both go to figuring out exactly which assets need work and so you can prioritize them, make sure you're being as cost effective as possible with the limited amount of money that we have to fix things, and then to go fix it.
That can actually help save money, right?
Yeah, that's right. So, and in many cases, like you have a failed culvert or something like that, if it fails, it's a lot more expensive to fix the damage from the water and the, you know, in some cases it collapses under a road or something like that. You have a lot of issues with that. If you can identify the places where, hey, we're really pushing it, this asset is not in good shape, and we've inventoried that, we can track that much more closely, then we can get to it before it becomes a bigger, more expensive problem. So that's exactly right. This is going to help us be more efficient. And it's not to say we're going to be able to catch up, but we would like to at least start chipping away so these backlogs don't just get longer and longer. The average life cycle of a playground, for example, is now up into the 30 or 40 years. So your kids are going to be playing on the same playground that you played on. That's not really good. So this is an effort to try to start addressing that.
Yeah, and it's more of a strategic thing, whether you put less on and hope that you get all, or put more on and hope that you get things. But I just think it's important to state, and that's
Yeah,
good to
and
hear
we're trying
from
to
you.
be as sophisticated as we can about the collection and use of data.
Yep.
And really be state of the practice on that.
Thank
Now
you.
let's hear about the inflationary increases, the contractual increases, and the commission-wide IT initiatives. What are those?
So 2C and 2D are similar. It's basically CPI increases on your current contracts and your supplies and materials. As you can imagine, fertilizer, grass seed, the wood mulch that goes in the playgrounds, I could go on and on. Even though our budget is majority personnel, I think it's about 30% or 25% supplies, materials, and other contracts. So the deal here is if you don't year to year apply CPI increases over time, you erode your buying power.
Okay, so this is just for the very
Yep.
basic maintenance stuff?
Yep, and then 2E, as you know, we're a bi-county agency, so we have certain functions that are performed centrally for both Prince George's and Montgomery County side. Certain enterprise IT efforts are among them, and these are money to advance certain initiatives in our countywide, commission-wide IT fund.
Okay, so those are those items. Now we have the Wi-Fi technology in public spaces, which is actually funded from the cable fund, and the GO committee will be taking that up.
Actually, I believe they already have, and I believe that they have approved that transfer. So you'll see down below, I have listed the total amount if you were to put all the funding requested from Tier 1 and Tier 2 on the reconciliation list. It did not include that funding. It's a transfer, and it did get approved through the GO committee. So,
Speak to that.
okay, go
I
ahead.
was there. I voted for it. So that one was already taken care of, and our park CIO is back here, was at the table fighting for it and explaining how important it is as one of the many ways to activate parks. So that's taken, we got 100,000 taken care of already. Everything else we need to put on the rec list here.
Okay, so the total is
The total is the.
1.696 then?
Yes, the 1696584. And I think now if there are other items that you'd want to add to that, would be a good time to talk about it.
And we're putting them on as two tranches,
Yes.
total, Tier 1 and Tier 2. So Tier 1 is 1,050,813, Tier 2 is 645,771, correct?
Correct.
Great.
Mr. Juanda.
Thank you, Mr. Reamer, and happy to support that. This kind of goes along, and I think you guys know where I'm going here, and I just am compelled, on behalf of Councilmember Hucker, who's in another hearing, and Councilmember Albernaz and myself, related to ball fields. I know that you've had discussions, Mr. Riley, about taking over the recreation centers that are currently, the fields associated with recreation centers that are currently managed by rec, very, very basic maintenance and not well. I recently, and we've discussed, been out to the White Oak Recreation Center, lot that gets a lot of use and is just in poor shape in a part of the county, in East County, where there's a lot of need in the middle of a highly densely populated community of apartments that run down from White Oak. And I think we need to prioritize. I know you have a plan to try to take those on over time and put them into your queue. But this proposal that I'm looking to add, along with my colleagues, is to add $174,000, and you tell me if this is not the right number, but to your budget, I think it is, to renovate this field, and obviously the other fields at the 4 recreation centers, and to prioritize that in this budget. So, again, on behalf of myself and Councilmember Hucker and Albernaz.
All right, so this is $174,000, so let's talk about that funding and what that would do if we were able to get that funded on the reconciliation list. Mike, have you had a chance to give
Yes.
some thought to that number, and what does it do for you?
Yeah, if I could just provide a little bit of background in context. this idea of parks moving into other agencies' ball fields started way back when, around 2000. There was a big push for us to start renovating school fields, and then once we renovate them and create a situation where they can succeed, we then maintain them. It went on for about 3 years, and we got to almost half of the elementary and middle schools, and then a recession hit, and it just kind of went on a back burner and not the priority of the decision makers. Then fast forward about 3 or 4 years ago, we resumed taking on additional school sites.
After I discovered that was a big gap,
Yes, you did. I wrote you a nice long letter with all that history I'm reciting. Yes, you
which was
did.
brought to me by a parent who asked,
Yes.
why was the PTA having to water the field? I don't know, let's find out. And then here we are.
It's a great question by the parent at that point. So anyone asking, why do schools maintain some schools and parks maintain?
Yeah.
It was old history. So we began about 3-4 years ago through the benefit of surplus money in the CUP fund balance, and I think Ramona Bell Pearson was here, if she's not still here. Thank you, CUP, because it had built a fund balance up, and that seemed a logical source to use to begin renovating additional school fields. So if you add up, and I'm not clear whether it was 15 or fiscal year 15 or fiscal year 16, we got our first appropriation, but if you add up what we've received from that fund source from when we resumed to what we believe will be appropriated in FY20, we're now up to $1,250,000, about $250,000 a year, and that will renovate about on average, about 5 elementary or middle school sites. So we're kind of crawling along with the schools. We have renovated the majority of the middle schools, and there's a reason for that. When this focus started long ago, the focus was by and large driven by leagues wanting better game fields on the weekends and evenings. So we tended to tackle the bigger sites, and the middle schools by nature would be bigger sites. So I think we're now have renovated and maintained somewhere in the 30s out of 40 middle schools. On the elementaries, we're maintaining less than half currently. There's about 80 schools to go, 85 schools to go that Parks has not come in, improved the soil, and then instituted the higher level of maintenance. So
To the rec centers, I'm
yes.
getting there, I know. But
So we're kind of on a snail's pace right now with the current funding level of doing 5 per year. It's, there's 80 schools left. If you do the math, it's 15 to 20 more years before we would, at that level, get to renovating and maintaining all the fields. So recently, at the semi-annual report, Councilmember Albernos brought up this old question about what about the county fields? Not a new discussion. It had happened as Gabe and I were both directors, but the reason it didn't go forward is where's the money coming from? That question was never answered because there's not a high level of money budgeted today in county government for the maintenance of those fields. So it
There you go.
It needed to be new money. So it never got anywhere. And Councilmember Joando, of course, you brought up White Oak at the semi-annual, and I agree with you. It's a high priority. So my thoughts would be globally that we would, over the summer months, look at all the remaining school sites that haven't been touched, the county sites, and come up with a menu of options for the committee to consider and see how aggressive you want to be about how fast you want to get all of these done, because I sense that doing it in 15 or 20 years is not satisfactory. But of course, to do that, we've got to identify the renovation, the source of money for the capital end, which is the renovation, and then the annual maintenance. Now, specifically to White Oak, if you asked us to jump into that in fiscal year 20, we'll have to work really quickly with Recreation Department to assure that it can be taken down, that we have the time to do it. And then if you also allocated the capital money to do that, you would then be committing, hopefully in the next fiscal year, in fiscal year 21, to give us the operating money that would be needed to do that higher level of maintenance.
and does the 174,000 fund the renovation of that field? Can I ask you, where was that
Yeah,
number
that's-
derived?
that was
Is that
the-
what their
That's-
number of the
understanding.
renovation?
My staff's work.
Okay.
Due to Councilmember Albernos' question, we immediately sent our experts out to each site. There are 6 rec centers, Damascus, Ross Body, Potomac, White Oak, Mid-County. And then there's a field next to, it's not a rec center, there's a field next to the Roundhouse Theater where the rec department currently is. So
But
there's
is the
six.
174,000 enough for White Oak, or is it enough for
Just,
all
that's
six?
just White Oak, because unfortunately that, again, we need to go in and totally re-improve the soil profile and, to set it up for success.
Okay,
Can I ask one question? Did you include the Roundhouse, their current headquarters space?
We came up with a capital estimate for the renovation of it and provided it to the Recreation Department.
Okay, the only reason I'm saying that is I'm not sure what's going to happen with that
yeah,
site.
that might be one
So,
it's not heavily used either, might not be one we
right,
want to.
and I would echo Mike's statement that we need to be comfortable that if we pay to renovate, we will have money to maintain.
Yeah, well, and the maintenance, just so we're on the maintenance yearly,
On average, probably about $10,000 a year,
okay.
much less than the upfront capital cost.
and as you mentioned, this field gets went a ton of use, and, I think we'll continue to do so. So that's why I understand the process, very happy about that, but I think this one's in an emergency situation.
Okay, so,
Oh, and just to be clear, our first choice is look at this in the summer and come up with a plan. But if you were asking us to do this now, we
Yeah.
would urge you not to make it a reconciliation item, but find a different source of revenue. The only one that's obvious is CUF, and I gave Ms. Bell Pearson a heads up about this. I know this is not something CUF Board has looked at, so I just want to be totally upfront about that.
okay, well, what I was.
Because we don't want it to compete against other things.
What I was gonna say is I think we ought to make this tier 3. I think there's a lot of interest in it, so I think we can get them all potentially, but I share your concern, like, we don't wanna lose funding for countywide initiatives, that are essential. But at the same time, I think when you got 3 council members asking for funding to support a field renovation, you wanna go with that. So let's see if we can kind of make everything happen here.
Can I also speak to that in terms of funding source? I think one of the things, the concern with the CUF money is that's one time. We have been trying to make sure we have enough money to ensure we can pay for the replacement IT system that is integral to all 3 agencies. You could choose to bond fund. That's been the original traditional funding source
For the renovation.
for ball field renovations. Until CUF had this fund balance, that was how they were funded. So that's another way to consider doing this.
Can you find that extra bond funding?
Well, you just won't be able to do road resurfacing or something else.
Is it tax, GO bonds or tax supported bonds?
Supported, yeah.
Tax supported bonds, right? Yeah.
I would suggest, if it's maybe just as, I hope this is helpful, that your approach, Mr. Reamer, to make it tier 3, and then we can talk offline about fund sources. and
Yeah.
all
Well,
those.
let's pursue this
We
idea
hadn't really
first of all.
considered this
Yeah.
until just today, so.
Sure.
Let's, first of all, you said, would you like us to present a plan for the rest of the schools? Yes. And actually, I think we've asked for that before. I don't think this is the first time, and not to put you on the spot, but we really want to do that. So this summer, let's have a FED meeting, and let's go through all the fields, and let's figure out the master plan to renovate these fields, and we'll start thinking about long-term, how we're going to identify the revenue sources. First time I've ever heard that GO funding, bond funding is an option. I never knew that.
That's how it was originally funded.
Yeah, so that's very interesting, so let's just talk about everything,
So can
big
we-
picture,
So tier 3.
Tier
we'll
3.
Discuss the funding.
and $174,000 for White Oak, and then we'll come back this summer and we'll discuss
Look at the longer list.
the bigger project.
Could I just, while we're thinking about it, I know if on the current trajectory of what we're doing now, is like 25 years to do all the ball fields. That doesn't even really include the rec centers. I'm assuming that would add another year, maybe, another 5. Those are larger properties in some cases. When we look at it, can you look at like what it would take to do everything within 10 years? When we come back to, what would the cost be, how we would do it, whether or not you even have the capacity for it, if you'd need to bring on more. 25 years is a lot to bite off, let's shoot for the moon in the decade. I'm no Jack Kennedy, but
But I think.
that seems like a reasonable time frame, and it's something that people can, you have a school-aged kid, your kid might still benefit from this plan in 10 years. In 25, your kid is going to have kids.
Let's include diamonds in that, not just soccer, but.
And we can explain some of the limitations. One of the reasons we haven't been able to move faster is not just because of the money, but because you have to work with schools. When are they going to renovate a school? When can we get the field offline? So that's a constraint as well, but we can make all that clear.
Yeah, let's think decade, everything, have it all done, have it all transferred, and what that would look like, and what the constraints would be to prevent us from doing it, and what we could do maybe to shake it loose. And I love the idea of thinking about it as CUP and tax-supported bonds, and having a plan as we head into the next CIP and figure out what our debt portfolio is. It seems like it's a good time to start thinking about long-term planning of how we fulfill what has been a priority of the council, and what, Chair Reamer deserves a lot of credit for really continuing to push in his tenure here.
Thank you.
Do we need a motion or anything, or you've got all that?
I think we're all.
Okay, good.
Let the record say if there needed to be a motion, you made it, and, we all agree.
Great.
Okay. I wish we were done, but we're not. I'm done.
Okay, but we're not, so I'm going to move forward. At the end of page 10 through page 11 and 12, what you're going to see are the funds, the Property Management Fund, the Enterprise Fund, and the Advanced Land Acquisition Revolving Fund. We can, if you want to take a minute, you have any questions on those, these are not part of the operating budget that you're going to be approving, but there is information about them because there's an overall appropriation that covers these funds, and there's information on how they're operating. In particular, the Enterprise Fund is projected to have revenue over expenses of more than $1.3 million, allowing it to allocate $500,000 transfer to capital improvements and place the rest in its reserves. On page 11 and 12, what you'll see is a little recap of how all those enterprise funds are doing and which ones we have. There's the ice rinks, the indoor tennis, event centers, park facilities, and total they have this balance. The only fund that actually loses a little bit of money are the event centers, but they are projected, while to have a negative return, so to not bring as much revenue as the expense, they're cutting it over 80% from FY19, so they're really making a huge improvement.
Okay, but this is not the Revenue Authority budget discussion.
Exactly. It's there for information. But we'll move on then to the administration fund. The administration fund includes the Bi-County Central Administrative Services, the Commissioner's Office, and the Planning Department. MNC PPC's total budget request for the administration fund was $33.4 million, representing a $1.6 to $7 million increase of about 5.2% over the FY19 adopted budget. And then you'll see in the middle of the page sort of how that's broken out by Commissioner's Office, Planning Department, CAS, and non-departmental, comparing the approved in FY19 to the FY20 request and the changes that is happening between those two fiscal years. The Commissioner's Office is relatively small. The budget request for FY20 is $1.3 million. It's a modest increase of about $27,000 over the FY19 budget. In the reductions that will need to be made to meet the executive's recommended budget, the Planning Department has agreed to cover any costs associated with that, so there's no change in the Commissioner's Office's budget. For the Planning Department, it is staffed and managed through 8 divisions. At the top of page 14 are those divisions, the FY19 and the FY20 requests, and the change in what those amounts are for each of those 8 divisions. The Director's Office, Management Services, IT and Innovation, Research and Special Projects, Functional Planning and Policy, the Area Teams 1, 2, and 3, Development, Applications and Regulatory Coordination Division, Support Services and Grants.
One moment, Mr. Tawanda.
Thank you, Pam. Just a note of the, I don't know if I know the answer to this, the 47.8% increase in the Director's Office. Could you just speak to what that is and what that's going for?
That is because I have shifted staff from other divisions into the director's office to work on the general plan. These are not new staff people. They were in other parts of the organization, but I've moved them into the director's office.
Got it. So no net, I don't, let me not use that term, but
Yeah.
reallocation of.
Yeah, no, the whole budget is only a 1.6% increase.
Yeah, got it.
Proposed budget is only 1.6. It's just moving people
The
around.
general plan, great, perfect, thank you.
You can see that reiterated down below in the work years. There's only a request to increase by one position, and really that is shifting a position, actually it's decreasing one position, sorry, got that wrong. Decrease of one position that is moving out of the planning department, the administration fund, and into the park fund, and it's for building maintenance for the new Wheaton headquarters.
Is our housing policy expert, Lisa Giovanni, gonna, what's her status gonna be?
Oh, we love her. She's going to be working in the research and special projects team, but she's there and she works on many, many different projects. So she has not been formally moved into the director's office, but she will be very involved with the general plan.
Part-time, wasn't she?
Oh, no, she's full-time.
Never mind,
Yep, no, she's fantastic.
she is.
All right, we're going to continue moving forward since we have a lot to cover. The next thing is on page 15 is the work program. The recommended schedule for master plans was presented to the council during the semi-annual presentation on April 2nd, and that schedule is attached on Circle 42. The council began discussing potential changes to the work program during that presentation to the by the planning board, but did not make any decisions and agreed that the PHED committee should continue this discussion. But I would like to note that as was mentioned at the semi-annual, it's not uncommon for the council as it approaches an election year to refrain from adding too much to the work program so the new council can do so. So there is some open space within the schedule. And below is the planning board's proposed work program that I separated out by area team, functional planning, research, and the director's office. You can see when those deliverables, when you see something coming into the council on a particular month, that is the month of the public hearing, not just the delivery date. It was just clear to say it's a public hearing, so when your work will actually start on these items.
Okay, before we go any further, let me just note for the record, Councilmember Katz asked me to note his support for a limited master plan amendment for the Glen Hills Stewart study area. I do not support that. Not making a motion for that. So we'll proceed. He just wanted to be sure that people were aware that he supported that. So keep going. Thank you, Pam.
Okay. So again, with respect to this proposed schedule, the one thing mentioned at the council discussion of the semi-annual was the delivery of the general plan update. And I will note that if you look at the schedule at the middle of page 15, it also had the Rustic Roads Master Plan and Pedestrian Master Plan coming together and only preceding the general plan by a couple months. So I reached out, I spoke with Ms. Wright, the planning director, who did say that she thought the general plan could move forward in time, come a little earlier to the council, give them more time to have it in their review. And then I suggest that we kind of shift, also maybe get the rustic roads a little earlier, maybe the pedestrian master plan a little later. If you'll turn the page, you'll see what that looks like. It's at the top of page 16. And you'll see that there's a couple placeholders. One is for Area 1 and the other one is under the Area 2 team. And there's been some brief discussion, some ideas being thrown around, the addition of a possible Silver Spring plan for the Area 1 team, and a new corridor plan, a transit plan for the Area 2 team. And I know that the planning department's ready to talk about that or any other ideas you may have.
Perfect. Let's hear about it.
So in terms of the Area 1 team, we had actually proposed a couple of years ago a South Silver Spring small area plan. You could also, I guess, call it a minor master plan, but it would be a subset of the Silver Spring Central Business District plan. And we're very enthusiastic about doing that. We think that the area in South Silver Spring is really, has lots of interesting potential. There's a lot of great projects coming up from the south in DC where they're working on the old Walter Reed campus, and there are some new projects on Georgia Avenue. There's also, as you all have probably seen, a new Target department store that has gone in right there on Eastern Avenue. We think there is momentum moving from the south. And we think that there is a lot in South Silver Spring that has potential. We have Jessup Blair Park. We have continuing conversations with Montgomery College about how they might activate that area. We have the old Discovery IT building, which some people call the Cowdoor building. And we have a number of other interesting opportunities. And so we're enthusiastic about adding that kind of plan. And then for the other placeholder, there have been, again, so many conversations now about corridor planning, and particularly the I-270 corridor. We all know there's conversation through the Managed Lanes project that perhaps isn't going quite the way we would hope, but it is a conversation. There's been conversation about the route of the CCT. There's been conversation about how to increase transit opportunities on 355 up to Clarksburg, which is sort of what was, I think, back in the early 90s originally envisioned when we thought about creating a transit line, was extending from Shady Grove on the east side of I-270 up to Clarksburg. So there's a lot of transit opportunities.
And don't forget Mark.
Oh, yes, and the idea that came out in a part of our Mark Rail Communities Plan of how can we enhance Mark going from particularly Boyd's in Germantown down to Shady Grove.
You alluded to it very briefly, but earlier this year, I worked with Councilmember Hucker to organize a letter to the governor, and County Executive Elrich and the council joined, laying out a specific vision of 270 transit that would be BRT service to Northern Virginia, because there is no MARC connection to Northern Virginia, and Metro takes a really long time, actually, an hour and a quarter from Shady Grove to Dulles, to Tysons. But if you could have special ramps going into the managed lanes on 270, you could actually build a really high-quality BRT connection from Northern Virginia to Montgomery County, which would be very mutually beneficial. So that would be something that might fit into this.
I think it would. And so we think there are a lot of very meaty and important issues that could be the subject of what we call a functional plan. It would be an I-270 corridor transit enhancement functional plan, and that would be a project that would come in on the heels of a sort of related project, the Shady Grove Amendment, that we're working on right now.
Okay.
So adding those two pieces would be, I think, very, very beneficial, and we definitely.
Where is that written up in here?
It's not.
Okay.
Well, a little bit it is. It's the top of page 16. You have the schedule itself, and you have the paragraph below it that said, as a starting point, the committee chair expressed interest in Silver Spring, and then another corridor plan, and that the planning department has suggested that, yes, they're in agreement with the Silver Spring plan and the possible new I-270 corridor functional transit plan. And the base holders are basically those hatched bars.
Yeah. Just to clarify, we are talking about Silver Spring, although you have described many initiatives focused in South Silver Spring, which would clearly be a part of it, but the boundaries are not settled. Let's just say that.
The boundaries are not settled.
Yeah.
And I think that's a point of conversation. I think that what we can do is, again, with these two projects added, we can come back over the summer perhaps and flesh out the scope for each of those projects and talk about, exactly what they would include.
Okay, I want to thank you. Thank you for your creative thinking. I wanted to make two comments. One, on the general plan, I think this is, we ought to spend some time modeling out now, and I really like now, in the next 2 months, how the planning board and the council can partner in the work of the early stage work of the general plan. One of my great anxieties about this is that it will delay somehow, circumstances will lose control. And if this delays too far, there may not be an appetite to take it up in this council term. And then, all of our work is sort of diminished, if not lost. So one way to address that is for the council and the planning board to partner on outreach. We could even potentially do hearings together. And we could just talk about how to kind of proportionalize, the work so that we are really staying on track, but also so that, the community expects the council to be aware of what is happening in the planning, in the community outreach. But often there's stage one outreach, and that's what the planning board does. And then there's stage two, which is the hearing. And it might be good for us to be more engaged in what you're doing at the board. But historically, the posture of the council has been, no, this is not for you. Don't show up at the planning board hearings because that's not your process. Let them do their process. You do your process when it comes to you. I think on this one, we ought to maybe kind of model out a different approach here that's a little bit more concurrent or partnered. And that might, I think on the one hand, it'll help us, certainly us on the PHED committee, who are going to have to do a lot of heavy lifting on this plan. It'll help us just be stronger and better and faster in what we're doing. But maybe we can get some council members also who are not on the PHED committee to be a part of that. And then that would just really facilitate, I think, a more constructive conversation.
Not to interrupt, I'm sorry, really quickly, I was just going to say there have been two sort of products that have come out of what they've already been working on in the planning department, the trend study and a strategic framework for the general plan, which we had hoped to bring to the PHED committee and or council before the budget started, but we had run out of time. There wasn't time to do it. So we'll try to plan to get that to you this summer, and that can be setting the stage for then setting up this plan to move forward if the committee's agreeable to
In
that.
addition to which, I'll just add, we are looking at a kickoff in June, and actually part of our strategy for that kickoff has been to reach out to council members and obviously the planning board members and have them, in a sense, sponsor some of the kickoff activities in different geographic parts of the county.
I think that's a great idea. I think what you need, though, is for the council to say, everybody participate.
Yeah.
There's a reason why you're being invited, and here's how it all fits in.
Right.
Well,
If I could just add to that, I agree. And when you came for the semi-annual, I said, look, let's, move it up. I think it's important to benefit from the expertise of the, I won't say retiring, but termed out council members, but also we have a good mix in getting it done. But I would agree, incorporating us earlier, one of the things that's been a shock to me, and I know it's the way the council works, is that we are so late in the process. And there are some good reasons for that, depending on what's being discussed as you bring plans to us. But I think with this plan, this general plan, in particular, it makes sense to bake in and incorporate our input and feedback and participation in the public's outreach.
I cannot agree more. And the other thing that I see as a benefit is that each of you have an amazing network of citizens and constituents and stakeholders that you do newsletters to, that you reach out to, that would be able to tap into that communication strategies that you all already have in place to start getting the word out about the general plan. So we see you all not only as participants, but essentially
Augmenting your budget, huh?
exactly. We want to put
Careful
you to
what you
work.
wish for. My network is tough.
Good, we want to put you all to work, in essence, getting the word out
Sure.
and being involved.
And in line with that, one of the things I wanted to mention briefly was with the research projects, and I'm totally good with adding the Silver Spring plan and the other smaller quarter plan. This affordable housing preservation and redevelopment feasibility and the preserving community value of ethnically diverse retail centers, for example. I know you're working on those. If there can be, it doesn't have to be reflected on the chart, but just points in time where we get feedback before July of 2021.
Before they're finished.
Yeah, and I just think being able to, hey, what about this? Or, just again, incorporating more times, particularly with the research, where there's not necessarily we're voting on a plan. And of trying to help inform that, I think, in setting up some mechanisms and points in time where we can give that feedback, whether it's in a committee setting or whatever, that's something that just, I think, would be helpful.
Terrific. Now, one of the items in your general plan is economic development, and I wanted to ask for a special report within the work of your economic development strategy for the general plan to focus a bit on this issue of universities and how the county can, A, better leverage the University of Maryland and integrate our economy more into the University of Maryland, but B, also potentially attract a new university. I've always been so inspired by what Mayor Bloomberg did in New York, where he actually attracted Cornell to open a new campus, and it was a STEM-focused campus, and it helped drive their whole resurgence as a global tech economy. I think we need to make some similar moves, and I've always wondered, how do you get started on the process of bringing in a university? That was partly what Great Seneca Science Corridor was supposed to be about. We had this vision that Johns Hopkins was going to do something like that here, and gradually we learned that all they really wanted to do was build and lease space. They didn't want to actually bring the intellectual capital, to the county. Maybe they'll one day change, but USG is a spectacular resource, but they actually, it's a lot of distance learning. They don't have the professors on the campus. Maybe there's a way to change that. Maybe we can, devise a model there. But a lot of it comes down to land and transportation, and that would be just a terrific study for you to do. Is that something you also have the same assessment of our county's strategic need to focus here? Any reactions to that, Gwen?
Yeah, no, I hear very regularly from Chair Anderson that it's all about the economy, stupid. It's really something that we have to.
Hopefully not with that word.
No, I was quoting
That would be inappropriate.
Mr. Clinton. So but it's really, it really is key to everything we do. And so we are going to have economy as a major, major focus of the general plan. And I think the study that Councilmember Reamer has just described is right on. And I think that we do have funding in consultant dollar funding for the general plan. We were going to have an economic study done, but this really helps perhaps frame that. And I'm very happy to work with any of your offices as we begin scoping out that economic study so that we can make sure it's sort of framing the right questions.
If there's a need for supplemental funding, let us know before the budget. I'm sure there'd be enthusiasm about ensuring that you can do precisely what you need to do. Casey, did you want to comment on this topic? I know it's been a big priority for you.
I think it fits into when we say the three pillars of the general plan are going to be economic competitiveness, environmental sustainability, and equity. What we mean by economic competitiveness is to figure out what is it about the economic geography of the region that we can take better advantage of, not just through land use and transportation, but the other things that the government does in order to facilitate job creation and economic opportunities. And that includes, yes, absolutely, University of Maryland, and I think that's the sleeper benefit of the Purple Line, is to connect not just the New Carrollton to Bethesda, but specifically College Park, Silver Spring, and Bethesda to really make the flagship state university a physically integrated part of Montgomery County's economic ecosystem. But it's also about Fort Meade in that area to the northeast. It's with 25,000 jobs, all these cryptography contractors serving Fort Meade. A lot of them are located in Howard County. How could we take better advantage of our proximity to Fort Meade? It's about Fort Detrick. It's about the Department of Energy. It's about NIH. It's about FDA. All those things and all the private sector employers that are proximate to us, so we're not constantly fixated on Fairfax County, Tyson's Corner. That's important, but there are a lot of other economic centers of activity in the region that we need to consider how can we be more effectively tied in. And the general plan, I hope, will be an opportunity to really give that a lot of thought. I think your idea is right on the mark, but it's just one of a number of them.
Subset of a broader issue, but it's just
Yes.
one that I feel like we really need to drill down and talk about. How can we get a new university into this county, and then start to generate that type of economy, as well as connecting better to existing universities in the region?
Yes, absolutely.
Andrew?
Thank you. I couldn't agree more with that. I think USG as well, one of the challenges that USG has is that it, while an amazing institution, doesn't have the ability really to lobby for itself through the university system. And so I think one of the areas where we should be working, with them is making changes at the state level through the Board of Regents and in the General Assembly to allow that to happen, to really treat it like the independent institution I believe it needs to be to serve the economic potential that I think it has for our workforce development and economic vitality in Montgomery County. And I think without that, we'll never be able to get there. And so I think we already have this asset. We have to do a better job of allowing it to be what it could be. I'm not opposed to, and I agree with you. I thought that was the idea of Hopkins. It never kind of materialized how we all wanted it, to be that. But I think there's an opportunity to relook at that. I mean, now that we have, now that Hopkins medical system has expanded, its footprint and now has a footprint in, Montgomery County, I think there are, opportunities to really rethink, what that was and see if we can at a high level try to make those partnerships. But I did want to, three things that aren't here. I agree with all of the suggestions that are part of this packet of things that you want to work on. And one that you were just mentioning is our federal assets. Just thinking more broadly of what are the regional and statewide federal assets that we get advantage from, and certainly as part of the fact that we have trained, retained, and attracted talent from all over the world thanks to them. But how are we using them and utilizing them with a strategic vision? I mean, you mentioned Fort Meade. Fort Meade is the cybersecurity capital of the world. And I'm not sure what we're doing in cybersecurity here in Montgomery County with intentional focus on that. I think there are individual companies that do extremely well that are headquartered in Silver Spring and Bethesda and Rockville in particular, but I don't think we've really given that the focus. Fort Detrick is a global leader on biohazards and some of the most difficult work in the world, and I'm sure that there's a lot of private sector opportunity with that as well. But there are a tremendous number of federal assets in Montgomery County, obviously, but also outside, and thinking through what that looks like. And then the two other areas, one is this question of suburban office, and I think taking a look at like you're talking about doing with some of these other efforts, but taking a look at what do we do? What are other jurisdictions doing to resolve this suburban office vacancy issue that expensive suburban jurisdictions like ours are having, that all of these large companies that used to want to be in a one building in a parking lot no longer want to be in a single building in a parking lot, and the companies that can survive are flocking to higher quality, newer assets closer into transit and are leaving behind buildings that we haven't really figured out exactly what we're going to do with them. And the second piece that we've talked a little bit is some of the light manufacturing that our committee has taken a look at, but just the broader question of light industrial areas. As some of that work has changed, there are tremendous opportunities in light industrial for relatively inexpensive properties that don't necessarily have to be knocked down, but can be rethought of in creative ways to create new types of uses, and that has become a really popular function, and I don't know that we have given it enough focus. And I think that having planning's leadership on that and looking at these different areas and providing feedback to the PHED committee, I think would be really helpful in allowing us to think about the economic development and workforce development work that we're trying to do here.
All right. So let's see where we're at.
I just have to ask, is there any other information about Glen Hills that you want? We completely agree that we do not support also adding that to the work program, although it sounds like a little tiny plan, it's actually huge.
I've spent 8 years
Huge.
working on this issue.
Yes.
And I think it's, I think we've done what we need to do. I really do.
And we are approving on a regular basis water and sewer category changes for individual property owners. The 2016 policy was to sort of deal case by case. We
Well,
have
the-
been.
The objective
and
of those who
it's
want a
working.
limited master plan is to change the basic water sewer category policy that the council reaffirmed in its vote last year.
Yep.
So that vote has been taken.
So thank you.
Okay.
Because that would be that would blow up this work program in terms of adding an enormous component.
Okay. So we need to, well, we haven't done tier 1 and tier 2 cuts
Right.
yet. We generally
You have a
had
list, I'm sorry, you have a list of the initiatives and professional services proposed by the department, and they're integrated into the work program that we've just had a long discussion of, and into the budget. So if we would turn to page 18, you basically have the reductions to meet the executive recommended funding level. And like Parks, planning has proposed, they relooked at their budget, they looked at costs, and they have proposed their own set of reductions to help meet the FY20 executive recommendation. And those reductions total $325,000, $366. And then they have a tier 1 departmental priority for restoration, which is, like Parks, it is the money needed for the Wheaton headquarters operating budget impacts. And then tier 2 is relatively small, but includes a reduced intern program, and eliminating the FY20 placemaking increase of $25,000, the preserving the community value of ethnically diverse retail centers, and then again, IT initiatives. Their portion of IT initiatives that make up tier 2. Staff supports restoring all of it.
Good. I think we're all in support. I know I am. Any comments here?
Yeah, I'm totally in support. I just want to make sure that the items that we talked about of the interest in adding, I saw the preserving of diverse shopping centers specifically listed. I just want to make sure that the other items that were discussed, including Silver Spring and 270 functional transit plan,
Everything
are
on the
included.
initiatives and professional services gets accomplished, although you do need tier 1 and tier 2, I think, to support some of that, right?
Yes.
Yes, and the reason that we can add those two projects in is that they are actually sort of pushed a little farther out, and we have staff finishing one project, and then they can move on to this other project. So like the folks working on Shady Grove can sort of finish Shady Grove and then move on to the corridor plan. And the folks working on Montgomery Hills, Forest Glen can finish that and move on to the Silver Spring. So that's why we're not asking for more staff to
Got
do
it.
these additional projects.
So everything that we've talked about and everything that's listed in the initiatives and professional services and the two new plans that we talked about, Silver Spring and 270, are included in the tier 1 and tier 2, if we add that to the rec list.
Yes.
Correct? Okay. That's,
Yep.
then I am totally comfortable
Belts and
and,
suspenders, absolutely.
yeah.
And I have to run out, but I'm in favor of putting tier 1 and tier 2 on the rec list as well.
Perfect. I think what that does is we can move then to the Central Administrative Services budget. For FY20, the Montgomery County portion of the proposed CAS budget before chargebacks is around $10.5 million. It's an increase of about $500,000 or 5.5% over the FY19 adopted budget. If you turn to page 20, at the top, you will see the allocation of money between the different departments at CAS, between FY19 and FY20, that is, between the adopted budget and the proposed. And to meet the county executive's proposed or recommended budget, CAS must reduce its requested amount by $350,201. And then there's a listing in the middle of page 20 at how they would meet that, the different departments and how much they would need to reduce them. You'll then see that staff made an error. Staff recommended restoring funding for certain amounts in their tier one, and I think it was because they presented items in tiers, like plannings and parks. But CAS is a little different in that you are going to meet by county, and you're going to approve this budget before the reconciliation. So they have also found savings. So the amount of money, they found savings of $104,666. So the amount that still, a reduction still needed by CAS is $245,535. Where I had recommended putting some of that back, it's really not possible because if it doesn't get funded on the reconciliation, you've already gone through the budget approval process by county. So it either has to be that they take no reduction or they take this $245,000 reduction. I know that's confusing, and I'm sorry I made the mistake in the staff report.
All right. Can you just say that again?
I will say
Either
it
we have
slower.
to.
Okay. CAS was looking at around a $350,000 reduction that they would have to take from their budget to meet the county executive's recommended budget.
Okay.
They found savings of approximately $104,000. That means that there's still $245,000 plus dollars that they would need to cut from their budget to meet the FY20 county executive's recommended budget.
Okay.
So they either have all of it restored or none of it restored, rather than putting pieces of it back. Because if it is proposed for the reconciliation list and somehow does not get funded on the reconciliation list, you've already approved their budget with the bi-county agencies before the reconciliation budget gets approved. It's a timing thing for CAS.
I'm not following.
Can you
So-
explain that
so-
better?
So regardless, they're going to go ahead and take a $120,000 cut or something. The only question is whether we can send them more.
So on May 9th, you will meet with the Prince George's County Council, and you will have to make your proposal for funding for CAS. And so what we have typically done in the past is we've had to say, here's the reduction we need to meet the executive target. And I don't, we haven't reached out to our Prince George's colleagues yet to know whether they are in a similar position of seeking reductions. So the reconciliation list just does not apply because on May 9th, you will be done with their budget once you have this bi-county meeting, just for this bi-county portion,
Just for CAS.
which is CAS.
Well, I just, not that I
So,
can,
before you, so, in other words, the executive's budget is the budget, or the committee recommendation is what we'll
Yeah,
take?
unless, right, so they would have to take the reductions, or we would have to propose the reductions.
So we have to speak for the council, essentially.
No, the council will meet the council
Our
always
council.
meets on May 6th, like 3 days before. And what would happen is if the Prince George's County does not agree with the CAS reductions, we would have to take them someplace else from the commission's budget unless, there are additional restorations during reconciliation. And so what your practice has been is to go to the bi-county meeting advocating for the reductions for CAS to make sure you're not ultimately disadvantaging the planning department or the parks department who would otherwise have to absorb any reduction.
So we go to,
So you would,
we go to the joint meeting saying,
full council on Monday, May 6th, the joint committee meeting with Prince George's County on May 9th.
you're not recommending
Reconciliation
any
is,
funds to the reconciliation list, you're saying
Correct.
support the cuts.
and with
Make
the
sure that they
exception
get
of the
done.
savings that they did find.
Which
So,
is 245 is the net, not
Exactly.
350, because they found a bucket, $105,000.
Exactly.
But what's the net result? I mean, the only concern that I have is, what is the net result of this happens? We say, hey, take the $245,000 reduction and figure it out. I mean, these are the support services that are supporting the parks and, and the planning departments. And so does it, even if it doesn't have an impact on the budget process, does it have an impact on the programmatic exercise of you doing your job?
yeah, thank you for that question. I do feel I should stick up for CAS a little bit here because it does wind up being, in both counties to some extent, viewed as not very interesting or sexy. The services they provide are not going to be the difference between doing a new Silver Spring master plan, for example, or getting the general plan done on time, or opening a new park, and yet they do support everything that we do. There are all these back office functions that are not high profile, but unless they don't work, but they're really important. And I would just say that I can't speak for Prince George's County, obviously, but my understanding is that Prince George's County's budget situation this year is different. It's usually we're the ones who can support a little bit more, and they maybe not are not as good a position. My understanding is they're having a better budget this year. We don't know that their council will push back on these reductions, but we have every reason to think that their council is going to be in a better position to fund these requests, perhaps than Montgomery County has, given the kind of budget year that we're having this year. So all that is just by way of saying we would like to advocate for some of these things to get back, and we certainly don't want to be in a position where it winds up trading off against things that are going on in the Montgomery County departments. But just so you understand, if you go to that bi-county meeting and you could accede to a Prince George's request to restore some of this, that I think would be the ideal situation, and with the backup plan being saying, here's the reductions that you could take.
So if as a result of the Prince George's County meeting, they don't restore something, then what we'd be doing is asking you to reallocate it to the Planning or Parks Department. And I do want to note the list of the specifics reductions are on Circle 35 through 36. I guess continuing on 38. So you can get a sense of the types of things that they would be reducing here.
Those are the reductions they've agreed to that make up the 105,000, or that's the 240, or the 350 total, of which?
I think the Tier 1, which is on 35 and 36 are things, and Tier 2 are the things that they
Would make up the 245.
would make up the 245, and then on page 38 are the ones that they think they can take.
Legal, non-department for a total of
Right, that's their-
104,666.
the
They're
saving.
agreeing to that.
That's the savings that said they,
And the ones they're not agreeing to are, or want back in, are circles 35, 36, and 37.
Correct.
So Marlene, can I ask a question? Because this is sort of a nuance I wasn't familiar with. If the reduction is not taken for the 240, I think it still puts the council down 240 compared to the executive, right? It's a
which is why what we've typically said is it needs to be reallocated, those reductions to the Planning Department or the Parks Department, which is why it's always been a very difficult situation, and the council in prior years have said, advocate for the reductions from CAS so that you're holding the other departments harmless from absorbing the additional cut.
And I think it would be planning only because it's the admin fund. And so it's not like they could go to parks, they would come to planning and say, find another 245,000.
So look, the bottom line is the executive's recommendation has put us in a tough spot, right? And there's not really an easy way out here. We may have to, maybe we can advocate for the cuts this year and say, look, we'll try to resolve this, any problems that are created next year, what are we supposed to do?
Well, my suggestion is, I think you're right. There's probably no way to avoid this tension when you are talking about going to the bi-county meeting, when both councils are sort of interacting over this for the first time. But if you think some of these projects are important, it might be good for the next budget cycle to have some more, at least staff-to-staff communication with the Prince George's Council, just so we can all be on the same page. We'd like to be synced up with what the Prince George's side wants to do, not just the side of the commission, but the Prince George's.
I would suggest if it's okay, and I'm sorry to butt in here, but I think the staff-to-staff has to happen even before for the executive's proposed budget, because I think one of the missing pieces here that we found throughout with, park and planning is, I think it would be helpful for there to be a real understanding on the executive side, prior to the budget going in, of what cuts would actually mean and what the practical application of those cuts would result in. And, you know, I understand this is all part of the budget process and you can't fund everything and there are priorities, but it seems that there are some nuances here, park and planning being an interesting bi-county agency that's different from most others that, you know, I think there could be some better and much more proactive communication happening at the executive side and then at the council staff to council staff side, so we all get on the same page and figure out how to do this so that we're not, you know, put in this situation where we might be making unfortunate cuts to what are, you know, back-end core services. But, you know, the reality of having $245,000 on the rec list for, you know, administrative services in, you know, the bi-county agency serving the planning department, I think it's going to be a tough sell to get to the votes that we would need based on all of the other competing priorities that it's against, not least of which are the ones that we're going to, you know, I want to make sure that we fight for and get with the Parks Department and the Planning Department already.
All right, so what's the
we will-
staff recommendation here, just to be really clear?
Just to take the recommendation for now, but again, this will have to be discussed with the Prince George's County Council. So we will propose to them the $245,000 in reduction, and we'll see where we come out with that discussion. When you have your
And
meeting.
you can let them know if they're willing to put up more money because they're flush with cash, because economic development, Miss Alsobrooks is doing such a great job of bringing businesses into Prince George's County that I personally, and I'm sure my colleagues, wouldn't stop them.
I will convey that you had that suggestion.
Probably not a good idea to convey that one.
Only in council member's name, of course.
I mean, I think we need to talk to them ahead of time and let them know.
Yeah, yes, and we do that. As soon as, in
This-
fact, right, you know, generally, we touch base after the committees have met and after the full council has met, so.
And this, again, this budget cut is, what was this was just part of the overall, this was the CAS share of the
It was-
overall
yeah,
$4
it was
million.
their prorated share, exactly.
So, okay,
We're done then.
we'll keep working on it, you know, nothing is ever over. Okay, well, thank you very much, great work, appreciate all of your work,
I think I may bring a sleeping bag and just sleep in this room. I feel like we spent most of the day here.
one of those days. Well, we have an OLO study to take up,
Yeah.
a 6-person panel.
Yeah.